Welcome to Edwardian Britain, an era so obsessed with appearances that even the furniture seemed to be trying to impress someone. It's the early 1900s, and the British Empire is at its glittering peak. The trains are fast, the dresses are enormous, and social anxiety is practically a national sport. Every drawing room hums with one unspoken fear. What if someone realises I'm not actually posh? The Edwardian dream was to look rich, sound refined, and behave as though one's ancestors had never held a shovel. If you didn't know which fork to use, you might as well have stabbed your social life with it. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardians inherited the manners of the Victorians, but with more dinner parties and fewer moral sermons. Theirs was an age of indulgence, a brief golden shimmer before the world exploded into war and rationing. The upper classes spent their days orchestrating elegance, from tea tables to tennis courts, while the newly rich and factory owners, financiers, and the occasional lucky gambler tried desperately to imitate them. This was not merely a lifestyle, it was a full-time performance. Wealth alone wasn't enough. You had to look like you'd been born knowing which side of the plate your oyster fork lived on. And oh, the pressure. Imagine every interaction as a subtle audition for acceptance. At afternoon tea you weren't just drinking. You were conducting a silent exam in social chemistry. Could you pour without spilling? Did you stir clockwise or counterclockwise? Did you hold the cup by the handle or cradle it like a peasant? The rules were endless, contradictory, and utterly exhausting. The Edwardian era was the kind of place where you could build a railway empire, but if you mispronounced Scoin, you were socially derailed. Manners were a form of currency, and possibly the most valuable one. Industrialisation had made money easier to earn, but respectability? That still required precision. A gentleman could climb from coal dust to country estate in one generation. But without the polish of etiquette, he was still a coal man in a top hat. The truly terrifying part was that everyone was watching. Servants, neighbours, relatives, and that one lady from Surrey who always knew exactly who was nouveau riche and who was merely pretending. For women, the stakes were even higher. Their clothing alone was a full-scale declaration of class allegiance, corsets so tight they could stop circulation. Fashion. White gloves so pristine you couldn't touch reality, essential, and heaven forbid you wore last season's gown to the same drawing room twice. Social suicide by fabric repetition. Edwardian women were expected to float through society like well-trained swans, graceful above the surface, frantically paddling beneath. But nowhere did the obsession with appearances reach such absurd heights as the dinner table. Meals were the theatre of refinement, where everyone performed civility while privately counting forks. The table setting looked like a silver-armoured army ready for deployment. 12 utensils, 6 glasses, 3 plates, and not a clue which was safe to touch first. Even conversation was choreographed, the right topic, the right tone, and absolutely no mention of digestion. To make it worse, the seating arrangement itself was a coded hierarchy. You might find yourself beside a duke or a disaster, but you'd better pretend you were thrilled either way. To the Edwardian mind, good manners weren't just social niceties, they were proof of moral superiority. They believed etiquette separated humans from animals, though considering the number of napkin-related incidents, that line was debatable. Every fork, bow and handshake became a performance of belonging. If you hesitated, even for a heartbeat, it wasn't just a faux pas, it was an existential crisis. A single slip could mean whispers at the next luncheon, a note unreturned, or worst of all, being labelled common. That word had the power of a curse. Of course, the irony was that everyone was terrified of everyone else. The aristocrats worried about being outdone by American heiresses, with more diamonds than discretion. The middle classes panicked about being caught copying the aristocrats too literally. And the poor, well, they mostly watched this collective nervous breakdown from the sidelines while eating with their hands and feeling strangely relaxed about it all. If you wanted to survive Edwardian high society, You needed not only the right clothes and table manners, but also the right attitude. You had to appear effortlessly confident, as if born knowing the proper distance between elbows at dinner. Pretending came naturally to most. It had to. The Edwardian social ladder wasn't climbed, it was tiptoed. Every gesture, every word, every nod of acknowledgement was a calculated move in a game no one ever officially explained. By the early 1910s, this culture of appearances had become both magnificent and ridiculous. Society waltzed on the edge of modernity, with telephones, motorcars, and electric lights, yet still obsessed over how one held a teacup. The empire was vast, the world was changing, and yet people could lose sleep wondering if they'd buttered their bread correctly. Beneath all the elegance lay panic, the fear of exposure, the dread of humiliation, the eternal question, am I doing this right? In the Edwardian world, image was everything, and reality was something to be quietly ignored. You could go broke keeping up appearances, but at least you'd look fabulous doing it. And when the dinner bell rang, the game began again, every fork gleaming, every guest smiling, every heart quietly pounding in fear of committing a crime against etiquette. Because in Edwardian Britain, reputation wasn't built on honour or heroism. It was built on posture, polish, and porcelain. And heaven help the soul who reached for the wrong fork. Picture this, an Edwardian dining room glowing with candlelight, the table so polished you can see your future humiliation reflected in it. Crystal glasses shimmer, silverware gleams like an army at attention, and the guests are seated, stiff-smiling and terrified. Welcome to dinner, the most dangerous 2 hours of your Edwardian life. This wasn't eating. This was combat. The Edwardian dinner party was where reputations were made, ruined, and occasionally digested. Every bite you took, every word you uttered, every clink of cutlery was a silent test of breeding. To outsiders, it looked like civility. To participants, it felt like a duel fought with forks instead of pistols. One wrong move, and suddenly your fork became a murder weapon for your reputation. From the moment the butler announced the first course, everyone assumed their positions like soldiers bracing for battle. The seating arrangement was strategy in itself. The host and hostess faced one another like opposing generals, while guests were arranged by status, charm, and conversational value. Being placed close to the host meant you were favoured. Being near the door to the servants' pantry meant you were one social step above the wallpaper. And yet no one dared complain, at least not until they got home and tore their gloves off in despair. Conversation was the opening volley. The art of dinner talk was as vital as knowing how to eat. Topics like politics, money, or religion were forbidden, unless, of course, you could discuss them in a way that made you seem intelligent without sounding like you'd read about it in a newspaper meant for commoners. A successful conversationalist floated from subject to subject like a hot air balloon, graceful, light, and full of gas. Compliments were essential, but flattery had to be disguised as observation. Your gown is exquisite was acceptable. You look lovely tonight was dangerously intimate. One misstep and your words could be misinterpreted as flirtation, arrogance, or worse, sincerity. And while you performed this social ballet, you were also expected to engage in the most perilous choreography of all, eating correctly. The Edwardians treated dining etiquette like sacred scripture, and deviation was sin. You must hold your knife as though it were a delicate quill, not a dagger. You must never sort your meat, never shovel your peas, and never, under any circumstances, lick anything. Forks were to be used in the left hand only. Switching hands mid-meal was considered practically an act of rebellion. The wrong movement could undo months of careful reputation building. The stakes were highest at formal dinners, where the number of courses increased exponentially with the host's ambition. 12 courses was common, as in 16 was bragging. Between the soup, fish, entree, roast, sweets, and cheese came waves of servants, each bearing new dishes and new opportunities for disgrace. Drop your fork once, and it was an accident. Drop it twice, and you were the scandal of the season. The tension was especially fierce among the aspiring classes, the newly rich desperate to blend in with the old guard. Many of them practiced in secret, drilling themselves on fork placement as if rehearsing for an etiquette exam. Some even hired dining tutors, professional experts who coached them on how to eat a pear with a knife and fork or peel an orange without looking like a miner on lunch break. These poor souls were the infantry of Edwardian society, terrified, undertrained and utterly surrounded. And then there were the hosts, the true tacticians of the evening. For them, a dinner party wasn't about food, it was about power. Who they invited, where they sat, and how well the meal went determined their social standing for months. A well-executed dinner could open doors to new alliances, marriages, or business ventures. A failed one could close them forever. It's no wonder Edwardian hostesses prepared like generals before battle. They rehearsed table settings, timed servant movements to the second, and even trained their cooks in foreign menus designed to dazzle. A soufflé collapse could be forgiven. A misseated duchess, never. Of course, under all this tension, people still managed to commit spectacular blunders. Guests accidentally drank from their neighbour's glass, attempted to eat the centrepiece fruit, which was often wax, or mistook the finger bowl for soup, a classic humiliation that lived in infamy. And because everything had to appear effortless, you couldn't acknowledge your mistake. You had to smile through it, like a condemned prisoner pretending the guillotine was a hat. The emotional cost of dinner was enormous. Every guest left with stomach cramps, not from food, but from holding their posture and pretending to enjoy the conversation. The social hierarchy was as rigid as the corsets people wore. Those above you could patronize you. Those below you had to admire you. And heaven forbid you showed genuine hunger. Eating too enthusiastically was gauche. You were expected to look as though you derived nourishment purely from charm. And yet, for all its absurdity, the Edwardian dinner table was where society defined itself. It was theatre, politics, and gossip all in one glittering package. Alliances were formed between mouthfuls, engagements were decided over pudding, and feuds began somewhere between the roast and the cheese course. The table wasn't a place to eat. It was a stage where everyone played their assigned role. When the final course was cleared and the port began to flow, the survivors of the evening could finally relax, just a little. The men retreated to the smoking room to boast or gossip, while the women withdrew to drawing rooms to dissect the evening's performances. Who had sparkled? Who had stumbled? Who had used the wrong fork? These post-battle reports would circulate for weeks, determining who ascended or fell in the endless war of Edwardian reputation. So yes, the Edwardian dinner wasn't a meal, it was a social skirmish fought under chandeliers. With weapons of silver and nerves of steel, the food was secondary, the performance was everything. You didn't eat to live, you dined to survive. In Edwardian Britain, the dinner table wasn't just a place to eat, it was a display case of civilization, and nothing embodied that more than the terrifying abundance of cutlery. If you thought you could survive with just a fork and knife, think again. The Edwardians turned eating into metallurgy. Every dish demanded a new tool, and every tool demanded a small miracle of memory. The table didn't merely glisten, it sparkled with anxiety. By the early 1900s, a proper dinner setting looked like a silver armoury. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. Rows of forks lined up like soldiers, knives gleaming like bayonets, and spoons of every conceivable size ready to confuse you. But to an Edwardian host, this was art. Each piece had a purpose, each placement to meaning. There was a fork for fish, a fork for meat, a fork for salad, and yes, even a fork for dessert. If it had a shape, there was probably a fork for it. Even soup had a fork in spirit. Cutlery was more than convenience. It was class made tangible. Owning a complete silver service wasn't just about eating, it was about belonging. The middle classes spent fortunes on matching sets, sometimes going into debt to acquire the latest patterns from Sheffield or London. Guests were expected to recognise the difference between a dessert knife and a fruit knife, and if they didn't, well, the table noticed. In Edwardian society, ignorance of cutlery was like showing up to a duel without a weapon, brave but fatal. Let's start with the infamous fish fork, the cornerstone of upper-class confusion. Fish, being delicate and prone to flaking, required its own specialised implement. The fork was shorter, flatter, and broader than its carnivorous cousin, designed to lift the tender flesh without mangling it. The matching fish knife wasn't really a knife at all, but a blunt-edged piece shaped like a miniature trowel, perfect for scooping and sliding. If you dared to use your regular knife instead, you risked not only judgment but audible gasps. Fish demanded finesse. You weren't eating it, you were escorting it politely into your mouth. Then came the oyster fork, a three-pronged wonder, small enough to disappear between your fingers and utterly terrifying in its specificity. Oyster forks were the only forks permitted on the right side of the plate, a violation of every other rule of table symmetry, because oysters arrived before the soup, and heaven forbid one's rhythm of utensil usage be disrupted. Most people barely ate oysters at all, but that didn't matter. The point was to own the fork. A true Edwardian host didn't serve food, they served proof of civilization. Moving on, there was the salad fork, shorter than the dinner fork but longer than the dessert one, with tines often slightly notched to capture those rebellious lettuce leaves. Then there was the pastry fork, a dainty creation with one wider tine designed for slicing delicate tarts. To the modern diner, this seems ridiculous, but in Edwardian logic, every variation was an act of refinement. Using the wrong fork wasn't a mistake, it was a confession. It said, I was not raised properly, and my ancestors were probably merchants. The obsession extended beyond forks. Knives had their own hierarchy, each suited to its culinary calling. There was the dinner knife, the butter knife, the fruit knife, and, if your hostess was especially ambitious, the game knife, sharpened for carving pheasant with aristocratic precision. The most elegant sets featured ivory handles, monograms, and intricate patterns etched into the blade, turning dinner into an archaeological expedition through social status. You didn't just eat, you unearthed your rank. Then came the spoons, those silent troublemakers of the silver family. There was the soup spoon, round and deep like a ladle for one, the dessert spoon, smaller and oval, the teaspoon, used strictly for tea and never for stirring coffee, that required a coffee spoon, and, if your household had gone completely mad with refinement, a demi-tasse spoon for after-dinner espresso. Each had its place in the procession, each represented a rung on the ladder between civility and sophistication. The absurdity reached its zenith in the grand dining sets of the aristocracy, some boasting over 100 individual pieces. Guests could spend the first 5 minutes of a meal just identifying the correct utensil, like archaeologists decoding a glittering puzzle. The rule of thumb was simple but cruel: start from the outside and work your way in. But that only worked if you could remember how many courses were coming, and in an Edwardian dinner, that number could be anything between too many and help me. What made the whole ritual even more absurd was that most people never used half of these utensils correctly. Many simply followed their neighbours, pretending to know what they were doing. The Edwardian dinner was an elaborate performance of confidence, a collective illusion held together by silver and sweat. One could imagine the unspoken mantra at every table: keep smiling, keep slicing, and for heaven's sake, don't touch the wrong fork. And of course the servants were watching. They knew every rule, every sequence, every placement. A good butler could spot an etiquette failure from across the room, the wrong knife angle, the misplaced dessert spoon, and correct it silently, efficiently, devastatingly. The guests might never notice, but the servants would. And in Edwardian Britain, the servants' opinions travelled faster than telegrams. Cutlery even carried its own vocabulary of aspiration. The wealthy flaunted silver sets by Tiffany or Mappin and Webb, while the merely comfortable settled for their electroplated imitations, the poor man's silver dazzling until it tarnished. For some families, polishing day was practically a religious observance, entire afternoons devoted to buffing away shame with cloth and elbow grease. You could measure your class not by your accent or your house, but by how well your spoons reflected the chandelier. The truth is, the Edwardian obsession with cutlery wasn't really about dining, it was about identity. A fork wasn't just a tool, it was a moral statement. To use the right one meant you belonged in polite society. To use the wrong one meant you'd betrayed your station, revealed your origins, and perhaps doomed your chances of marrying up. The dinner table was the stage, and the silver was the script. All you had to do was remember your lines. In the end, Edwardian cutlery wasn't designed to make eating easier. It was designed to make it harder, precisely so that only those born to the ritual could perform it with grace. Food was fleeting, but silver lasted, polished, gleaming, judgmental. And if you happened to grab the wrong fork in a moment of confusion, well, don't worry. Someone saw. Someone always saw. If Edwardian society had a holy scripture, it wasn't the Bible, it was the etiquette manual. And in that polished, panic-stricken world, no text was studied more religiously. These weren't just books. They were survival guides for avoiding public fork disgrace. They taught you how to walk, talk, eat, breathe, and, if necessary, die politely. By the early 1800s, Britain and America were in the throes of an etiquette empire, a paper kingdom ruled by authors who understood that social fear was the most lucrative industry of all. At the heart of this empire stood Mrs. Isabella Beeton, the original queen of domestic order. Her book of household management wasn't just a cookbook, it was a 1,000-page blueprint for living a morally correct life with perfectly folded napkins. She didn't simply tell readers how to make mutton stew, she told them how to be the kind of person who served it with grace. A place for everything and everything in its place, as she declared, which in Edwardian terms applied equally to silverware, servants, and emotions. Mrs. Beeton's influence outlived her by decades. She died tragically young in 1865, but her ghost remained haunting every Edwardian dinner table like a stern housekeeper with a ledger. Her rules have become gospel: how to address guests, how to serve wine, even how to deal with inconvenient topics like indigestion. Do not allude to it, no matter how dire. Beeton didn't just describe domestic life, she defined it. To own her book was to announce that you aspire to civility, that you might someday host a dinner without public embarrassment or visible panic. By the Edwardian period, her commandments had spawned 1,000 imitators. Etiquette guides were flying off presses faster than scandals out of high society. Every class wanted one. The old aristocracy to reaffirm their superiority, the new middle class to fake it convincingly, and even the lower classes, some of whom treated these manuals as a kind of passport to better employment. They didn't call it self-help, but that's exactly what it was, the Edwardian version of how to win friends and influence duchesses. And then came the Americans. Across the Atlantic, Emily Post would later perfect the art of social rulemaking. But even before her, American society was busy industrializing manners. If Britain turned etiquette into ritual, America turned it into business. Publishers realized that fear of embarrassment was an untapped goldmine. Want to dine like a duke? There's a guide for that. Want to impress the colonel's wife? There's a guide for that too. Want to figure out what to do when the wrong fork appears? By Volume 2, it's a series now. For Edwardians, etiquette wasn't optional, it was a weapon. The rules didn't just create order, they enforced class. The aristocracy had centuries of practice, but the middle classes had manuals, and in their desperation to imitate the elite, they followed every printed instruction as if divine. If Mrs. Beeton said flowers must be arranged symmetrically, you could bet that thousands of suburban homes suddenly looked like botanical battlefields. And when later writers like Lady Trowbridge and Mrs. Humphrey, Madge of Truth in the newspapers, released their own etiquette books, they didn't offer advice. They offered hope. These guides instructed Edwardians on the proper behaviour for every possible situation. How to greet a duke without fainting. How to seat an unwanted aunt. How to respond if your dinner partner mentions trade you don't. How to subtly exit a room without turning your back to your social superior. You pivot like a respectful teapot. The sheer volume of rules was staggering. It wasn't etiquette anymore. It was bureaucracy. But what made these manuals so powerful was their tone. They didn't shout. They whispered. They spoke with calm authority, assuring readers that salvation was only a few well-timed bows away. They weren't threatening. They were comforting, like a kindly aunt explaining how not to disgrace the family name in public. For people terrified of social failure, they were the only lifeline. After all, not everyone had a governess to drill them in the art of not existing too loudly. The result was a kind of moral inflation. Politeness became synonymous with virtue, and bad manners were treated as near criminal offences. To be ill-mannered wasn't simply embarrassing, it was immoral. The books insisted that true refinement came from inner grace, but the subtext was clear. Inner grace required outer polish. In Edwardian Britain, you could commit nearly any sin, but if you wrote your thank you notes promptly, society might still forgive you. The popularity of these manuals also revealed a deep anxiety, the fear of not knowing. Industrialisation had blurred class lines, giving ordinary people access to wealth and education, but not always the social training that went with it. Etiquette filled that gap, promising certainty in a changing world. Where once you might inherit your manners along with your estate, now you could simply read your way to refinement. It was social climbing by subscription. Of course, it wasn't all high-minded civility. The sheer absurdity of some rules bordered on comedy. There were detailed instructions for how to ring a doorbell, not too loudly lest you appear impatient, how to sit in a carriage at a 45-degree angle of modesty, and even how to blow one's nose with dignity, quietly with linen, and preferably in another room. The Edwardian obsession with propriety made everyday life a minefield. You couldn't even sneeze without wondering whether it was socially acceptable to exist afterward. And yet, for all its rigidity, the etiquette craze did have a strange kind of charm. It offered a sense of belonging in an age obsessed with status. Everyone, from the duchess to the dressmaker, could at least aspire to good manners. The rules might have been impossible, but the illusion of mastery was soothing. By the time the First World War began, the etiquette empire was at its height. Every bookshelf groaned under the weight of printed decency. The world might be changing, suffragettes marching, empires shifting, machines roaring, but at dinner, everything still obeyed Mrs. Beeton's ghost. And when the forks glittered under candlelight, every Edwardian could pretend, just for a moment, that order and grace were still the natural state of things. Because in Edwardian society, etiquette wasn't just how you behaved, it was how you survived. And heaven help the soul who forgot which spoon to use while the book was still watching. If the Edwardian dinner table was a battlefield, then the hostess was the general, impeccably dressed, terrifyingly calm and armed with an army of servants, a ticking clock, and the knowledge that one misplaced guest could end her social career. Behind every glittering chandelier and every course of perfectly chilled sorbet was a woman conducting warfare in silk. Her weapons weren't swords or rifles, but menus, manners, and an iron will wrapped in lace. Hosting a dinner wasn't a hobby, it was a campaign. The Edwardian hostess's job was to create an evening so seamless that no one noticed how much blood, sweat, and scheduling had gone into it. Timing was everything. The soup had to arrive hot, the wine chilled, the conversation sparkling, and the servants invisible. Dinner began not when the guests were ready, but when she was, and heaven help anyone who was late. Punctuality in her eyes was the difference between civilization and chaos. Before a single guest even set foot in her house, weeks of planning had gone into the event. Invitations were handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered with all the ceremony of a royal decree. The wording mattered immensely. It told recipients exactly what kind of evening to expect and whether they were being invited to dine with dukes or merely with ambitious neighbours. Decline too casually, and you'd find yourself mysteriously uninvited to everything else for the season. The Edwardian hostess never forgot a slight. She just added it to the seating chart. Ah yes, the seating chart. The hostess's greatest weapon and deepest torment. To seat guests correctly was to control the very fabric of the evening. The most important man, ranked by title, wealth, or gossip value, must sit to her right. the second most important to her left, and the remaining guests arranged like chess pieces, never too far from someone interesting, never too close to someone boring, and absolutely never next to their spouse. Married couples were split up deliberately. The goal was not comfort, but chemistry. The right pairing could spark lively conversation. The wrong one could freeze an entire table faster than bad soup. And speaking of soup, the menu itself was a map of ambition. The hostess consulted her cook, or, if she was particularly high-ranking, her chef, to design a procession of dishes that impressed without offending. There was art to this. A simple roast might look too plain, while something too exotic could be accused of showing off. Game, pâté, truffles, and soufflés all carried coded messages. I am wealthy, worldly, and capable of orchestrating complex logistics involving fire. Every dish had to arrive at precisely the right moment, under the right temperature, and preferably without catching on fire, unless, of course, it was a flambé, in which case it had better look intentional. The hostess oversaw everything, down to the spacing of the flowers and the polish on the silver. Servants worked like a backstage crew, executing her vision with military precision. The butler commanded the wine service. The footman served in perfect synchrony, advancing and retreating like well-trained infantry. A skilled hostess could direct this entire operation with a single glance. If she raised her eyebrow, the staff froze. If she smiled, the evening relaxed. She didn't need to shout. Her authority was absolute. Yet her job didn't end with logistics. She was also the evening's emotional anchor, the mood manager of the Edwardian world. While her husband sat at the far end of the table, occasionally nodding or telling long-winded hunting stories, she was busy orchestrating harmony. She guided conversation, bridged awkward silences, and gently redirected wandering topics before they turned scandalous. A good hostess could make 10 people feel brilliant. A great one could make boring people feel brilliant. Her charm was strategic. Compliments were distributed like rations, just enough to sustain morale, never enough to embolden rebellion. She asked questions that made guests feel seen, even as she silently assessed their worth. If someone bored her, she hid it behind a radiant smile. If someone offended her, they would never know until their next invitation failed to arrive. If you crossed the hostess, society whispered, you didn't get dessert or a second invitation. And in Edwardian circles, that was social death by starvation. But beneath all this grace and control lay exhaustion. Being an Edwardian hostess was an Olympic event disguised as leisure. Days were spent rehearsing disaster prevention, ensuring the pianist didn't play too loudly, the candles didn't drip, and the cook didn't quit mid-course. Even her wardrobe was strategic, gowns designed for maximum elegance and minimum movement. Layers of silk, corset, and jewellery transformed her into a symbol of refinement, but also a prisoner of presentation. While her guests dined comfortably, she was holding her breath, and literally did, to keep the illusion intact. And illusions were everything. The Edwardian hostess's reputation depended entirely on how effortless her effort looked. A perfect evening didn't just impress, it elevated her standing. Invitations were currency, and hosting well meant securing a place in the upper ranks of society. The right dinner could connect her husband with a potential business partner, attract a titled marriage for her daughter, or simply keep her from being forgotten by the season's elite. In that sense, her dinner table was more powerful than Parliament. Decisions made under her chandelier could change futures. Of course, failure was equally powerful. One undercooked bird, one mismatched wine, one awkward silence that stretched too long, and the whispers would begin before dessert was served. The butler might not say a word, but the rumour would travel faster than telegrams. Did you hear? Lady Frobisher ran out of sherry. Scandal didn't require crime, just poor timing and tepid soup. Yet despite the risks, the Edwardian hostess reigned supreme in her domain. In a society where women's power was limited, the dining room was her command post. It was one of the few spaces where she could lead, manipulate, and conquer without appearing to do so. Behind every gracious smile was a tactician, Behind every delicate toast a strategist. She may have been expected to flutter, but she ruled. When the final guest departed and the last candle flickered out, she could finally exhale. Victorious perhaps, but never complacent. Tomorrow's breakfast would bring new gossip, new alliances, and new rival hostesses plotting their own campaigns. In the Edwardian world, you didn't just host dinner, you fought dinner, and only the strong survived to serve dessert. In Edwardian Britain, no performance of refinement was ever truly private. Behind every immaculate dinner, every polished banister, every perfectly timed toast stood an army of silent witnesses, the servants. They were the gears that made the grand machine of society run, invisible when perfect, unforgettable when slighted. To the Edwardians, they were indispensable. To the servants themselves, the upper classes were a never-ending source of entertainment. And while the guests were busy judging one another, the servants were quietly judging everyone. The Edwardian household operated like a miniature kingdom. The master and mistress may have ruled, but the servants kept the realm from collapsing under the weight of its own self-importance. There were cooks, maids, valets, footmen, housekeepers, nannies, coachmen, butlers, scullery maids, laundress, an entire ecosystem of human cogs that made daily life appear effortless. The grander the house, the more servants it required. A respectable country estate could have dozens. A true mansion had hundreds. And if you could only afford one servant, you still pretended you had 3. Yet within this hierarchy, the butler reigned supreme. The butler wasn't just a man who poured wine, he was the arbiter of respectability. He knew your schedule, your secrets, and your weaknesses. A good butler was discreet, a great one was omniscient. His mere expression could destroy reputations faster than gossip columns. If your butler raised an eyebrow, it was basically a Yelp review in human form. Guests might never know what they'd done wrong, but by the next morning the entire household would. Beneath the butler came the housekeeper, the general of the domestic army. She ruled the female staff with a mix of fairness and fear, keeping the house running with clockwork precision. She was responsible for everything from linen inventory to moral stability. If a maid flirted too openly with a footman, the housekeeper would know, and the maid's future prospects would vanish faster than the good china after an accident. The housekeeper's approval meant stability. Her disapproval meant being replaced by someone who could dust without sighing audibly. For all their discretion, servants noticed everything. They could tell which guests were nervous, who drank too much, who ignored the hostess's cues, who used the wrong fork, and who secretly despised whom. They were human barometers of social tension. While their employers performed elegance above stairs, the servants downstairs exchanged quiet commentary, sharp as any newspaper review. After all, they had front-row seats to the world's longest-running theatre production. High society pretends to eat calmly. Dinner service itself was a military drill of silence and choreography. Footmen glided between chairs, refilling glasses without making a sound. Plates were replaced with precision, conversation was never interrupted, and eye contact was avoided at all costs, unless of course a guest made a blunder. Then a single flicker of amusement in a servant's eyes could ruin a person's appetite. It wasn't malice. It was simply the unspoken hierarchy of judgment. Guests judged one another. Servants judged everyone. The servants' hall, their own dining area, usually in the basement, was a world apart. There the truth flowed freely. Gossip was currency, and stories of upstairs absurdities were their entertainment. They might have polished the silver, but they also polished anecdotes. Lady so-and-so's wig nearly falling into her soup, or the new money gentleman who tried to tip the butler after dessert, an unforgivable breach. The servants' hall was where dignity came to die and laughter was the nightly dessert. Ironically, the entire structure of Edwardian society depended on this invisible class of people who had no social existence of their own. Servants were expected to be present but unseen, efficient but voiceless. A good servant, one manual advised, is like good air, noticed only when absent. They worked 12 to 16-hour days, with one afternoon off a week if they were lucky. They lived where they worked, slept in cramped quarters, and were paid wages that wouldn't cover their master's cigar budget. And yet, the illusion of upper-class tranquility depended entirely on their endurance. For the servants, knowledge was power, and they had plenty of it. They knew who was in debt, who was in love, who was pretending to be richer than they were. The butler saw every letter delivered. The lady's maid heard every whispered secret. The cook overheard every conversation through the kitchen door. Entire reputations could rest on their silence. This gave the clever ones quiet leverage. A discreet servant was treasured. A talkative one was a public relations disaster. Some even managed to rise through the ranks by knowing just enough to be indispensable. And yet, for all the hierarchy, there was genuine pride in service. To work for a distinguished household was considered an honourable career. Footmen competed for positions in aristocratic families the way modern graduates compete for jobs at prestigious firms. They measured their status by livery, not salary. The taller the footman, the higher his pay. A 6-foot footman could earn twice as much as his shorter colleagues. It was a system of measurement so absurdly British that no one even questioned it. Of course, not every servant was content. Some quietly rebelled through subtle sabotage, a slightly oversalted dish, a misfolded napkin, or the mysterious disappearance of an unpopular guest's umbrella. Others simply observed, storing away details for the memoirs they'd one day publish. Many of the juiciest accounts of Edwardian society come from these tell-all recollections, servants who, after decades of silence, finally gave the world an unfiltered view of the upper classes behaving like very expensive children. To the Edwardians upstairs, servants were tools of status, proof that you had arrived. To the servants below, the upper classes were entertainment, employers, and occasionally cautionary tales. They watched, remembered, and occasionally judged with far sharper accuracy than the society pages ever did. In an age obsessed with appearances, they were the only ones who saw the truth behind the curtains, the wine stains, the trembling hands, the whispered quarrels after guests departed. So while the hostess planned her perfect dinner and the guests rehearsed their charm, the servants stood in the wings silently grading the performance. And when the night ended and the chandeliers dimmed, the true verdict of the evening wasn't written in the newspapers, it was muttered downstairs over leftover pudding. In Edwardian Britain, respectability wasn't built solely on silver, charm, or etiquette. It was built on the silent approval of the people polishing your forks. And if your butler ever raised that fateful eyebrow, congratulations, your reputation had just been reviewed. Nothing in Edwardian dining struck terror into the human soul quite like the first course, soup. It looked innocent enough, steaming gently in fine porcelain, perfumed with herbs and dignity. But make no mistake, this was not nourishment. This was an initiation ritual. One false move, and your place in society was reduced from guest of honour to person everyone avoids at future luncheons. The first spoonful wasn't about flavour, it was about control. One loud sip and suddenly you were downgraded from respectable to barn animal. The soup course marked the start of the evening's psychological warfare. After the anxious procession to the dining room, the orchestral seating manoeuvres, and the ceremonial napkin unfurling, guests faced their first trial by broth. The Edwardians turned the act of eating soup, something most mammals accomplish effortlessly, into a high-stakes performance that tested grace, discipline, and lung capacity. Rule number 1, you never blew on your soup. That was barbaric. No matter how much steam threatened to melt your eyebrows, you waited. True refinement meant pretending temperature didn't affect you. You sipped serenity while your tongue blistered in silence. Edwardians were expected to endure molten consommé with the same stoicism reserved for funerals and dental surgery. The idea was simple. Pain builds character and manners. Then there was the issue of how to sip. The spoon must glide away from you, not toward you, a delicate outward motion that suggested restraint and purity of soul. Bringing the spoon inward was considered gluttonous, a gesture of greed. Outward meant elegance, inward meant piggishness, and heaven forbid you slurp. The Edwardians loathed noise at the table. A single audible sip could silence conversation. The offender would be met with a sudden, terrible stillness, a momentary pause in which a dozen pairs of eyes communicated the same message. You are dead to us. Even the shape of the spoon mattered. The round soup spoons, ideal for thicker broths, had to be handled differently than the oval one, reserved for clear soups. To spill a drop on the tablecloth was a minor tragedy. To spill it on your clothing was a national embarrassment, and wiping your mouth with the wrong side of your napkin, practically an act of rebellion. The true masters of etiquette could navigate this entire sequence, scoop, sip, dab, smile, without once making a sound or appearing mortal. The terror didn't end there. There was also the dreaded soup plate tilt. At the end of the course, when only a few spoonfuls remained, one faced an ethical dilemma. To tilt or not to tilt? Technically, you were allowed to tilt the plate, slightly away from you, never toward, to collect the last trace of liquid. But tilt too much and it looked greedy. Tilt too little, and you left behind evidence of waste. It was the moral equivalent of a balancing act between sin and sanctity, all over a bowl of bouillon. For newcomers to polite society, soup was the course most likely to expose impostors. Many an ambitious merchant's wife or freshly knighted gentleman met their social demise at this stage. The middle classes practiced for weeks before their first grand dinner, rehearsing spoon angles and wrist movements over bowls of practice broth. Some manuals even recommended training at home with water, since wasting actual soup was too decadent for educational use. It was said that a single dinner could be the making of a reputation, or the unmaking of it, one droplet at a time. The servants naturally observed this entire drama with professional detachment, though it's safe to assume that below stairs, laughter was had. They'd seen it all, trembling hands, nervous sweating, whispered prayers for steady spoons. The butler, standing like a silent referee, would note every misstep. A clink too loud? The guest was new money. A spoonful too generous? Colonial? Someone blowing on their soup? American. The silent cataloguing of character was relentless. Even the soups themselves carried social codes. Clear soups like consommé or bouillon were considered the height of refinement, delicate, transparent, civilized. Thick soups, chowders, bisques, or anything resembling stew were considered hearty, even crude. A good hostess would never dream of serving anything that left residue on the spoon. Soups had to whisper, not announce. The consistency of the broth said as much about the household's breeding as the silverware did. And yet, amid all this formality, a strange kind of theatre unfolded. The soup course was the calm before the storm, a moment when everyone tried to appear serene, while secretly preparing for the chaos of courses to come. The guests' faces remained smooth, but their minds raced with logistical terror. Was the fish fork next? How much should one drink before the meat arrived? Was the host's smile genuine, or a polite warning? The soup, in its deceptive simplicity, gave them time to panic in sense. Children of the upper classes learned this early. Their governesses drilled them mercilessly in proper spoon deportment. No child of breeding would dare return home from boarding school unable to handle soup. Failure would reflect poorly not just on them, but on their entire lineage. There were even etiquette exams where students were graded on slurping restraint, the equivalent of a modern pop quiz in social survival. The irony, of course, was that soup, once a humble, warming meal for peasants, had become the most aristocratic of dishes. What began as nourishment for survival had evolved into a liquid symbol of restraint. It was food reimagined as virtue. To eat soup well was to master yourself. To eat it poorly was to confess your origins. When the final spoon was set down and the bowls whisked away, the collective exhale was almost audible. The worst was over, or at least the first battle had been survived. Smiles returned, conversation resumed, and the orchestra of cutlery prepared for its next act. But beneath the calm surface, hearts still raced. The soup might have been finished, but the fear lingered. Because in Edwardian Britain, the first course wasn't about flavour or nourishment, It was about proving that you could be trusted with a spoon, that civilization, however fragile, was safe in your trembling hands. If there was one thing more terrifying than being caught without an invitation, it was being caught with the wrong fork. The Edwardians lived in a world where social stability rested on silver. Wars were not declared over politics, but over salad utensils. And in that glittering hyper-polite minefield known as the dinner table, a single misused fork could cause more damage than a scandalous affair. He used a fish knife for salad. Society never recovered. To the modern mind, this sounds absurd, but in the Edwardian imagination, table manners were not minor niceties. They were moral indicators. The wrong utensil implied poor breeding, and poor breeding was the one thing that could not be forgiven, even if you cured smallpox or built a railway. The table was a stage, and your fork was your script. Forget your line, and you were out of the show. The newspapers of the time didn't shy away from documenting such culinary catastrophes. A 1908 Society column recounts the tale of a newly rich industrialist who, at a London dinner party, began eating his salad with a fish knife. The room froze. The hostess reportedly went pale. One guest dropped her spoon in shock. The butler's nostrils flared so dramatically that it became legend among the staff. The man's reputation never recovered. His business thrived, yes, but his dinner invitations vanished faster than pudding at a children's table. The incident became shorthand for social obliviousness. He's a fish knife for salad sort of man. That phrase, whispered behind fans and monocles, condemned dozens of aspiring social climbers before they ever reached the table. For the Edwardians, dining was Darwinian. The well-mannered survived. The careless were devoured. Politely, of course. Another famous example came from the ill-fated dinner of Lady Swinburne in 1910. She hosted a glittering soirée for 40 guests, including a minor royal and a duke with more titles than conversational skills. Among them was a young woman recently engaged to an aristocrat's son, a middle-class beauty with good looks, charm, and, as it turned out, catastrophic instincts for cutlery. When the fish course arrived, she reached for her dessert fork instead of her fish fork. Gasps rippled across the table like a scandalized breeze. Her fiancé's mother nearly fainted into her consommé. The girl realized her mistake too late. Panic set in. She froze, fork hovering mid-air, as though hoping time would reverse. It did not. The servants noticed. The host noticed. The duke noticed. By dessert, her fate was sealed. The engagement was quietly dissolved 2 weeks later. The official reason given was incompatibility. The unofficial reason, whispered across London drawing rooms, was the fork. Such stories spread with gleeful cruelty. They were cautionary tales for the ambitious. Morality plays in silver and shame. Etiquette books doubled down, warning readers that misuse of cutlery may brand one irredeemably. Some even included diagrams illustrating the tragic consequences of choosing the wrong utensil. The Edwardians, it seems, had perfected the art of overreaction in the name of refinement. What made these fork fiascos so potent was that they revealed what everyone secretly feared, the fragility of belonging. In an age where new money mingled uneasily with old, manners were the border patrol of class. The aristocracy guarded their social territory with silver-plated walls, and the fork was the gate key. If you didn't know which one to use, you didn't belong, no matter how many servants you employed, or how much coal you mined. Even the royal family wasn't immune to scrutiny. There's a persistent rumour, perhaps apocryphal but delicious nonetheless, that a visiting European prince once used the wrong side of his knife to butter his bread during a state dinner at Windsor. Queen Alexandra reportedly smiled politely but never invited him again. The story became the kind of polite legend that people retold with relish, proof that even blue blood couldn't protect you from stainless steel disgrace. Servants, of course, witnessed every tragedy up close. They'd seen trembling hands reach for the wrong utensil, eyes widen in horror, forks clatter like guilt. Below stairs they swapped stories of the Great Fork incident of '09, the way soldiers swap tales of past campaigns. The difference was that in this war no one died, except reputations. The butler's quiet observation became social gospel. If he said "Madam appeared uncertain during the entree," that phrase could haunt you for years. For hostesses, avoiding a fork fiasco among guests was a logistical nightmare. They sometimes employed subtle interventions, rearranging utensils mid-meal, signalling discreetly to the nervous, or instructing footmen to replace utensils before catastrophe struck. Others, more ruthless, used fork confusion as sport, a way to expose imposters. Invitations to their dinners were social traps disguised as hospitality. The guests might arrive hopeful, they left humbled, their self-confidence skewered neatly between the salad and the roast. And yet, amid all this anxiety, the Edwardians never questioned the system itself. To them, the precision of manners justified the madness. The dinner table was where civilization proved itself one utensil at a time. To master it was to belong to the highest echelons of humanity. To fail was to reveal one's inner chaos, the lurking truth that no amount of polish could hide. Some modern commentators might laugh at their fragility, but the Edwardians would have found our informality equally appalling. They would watch in horror as someone today twirled spaghetti with a fork and spoon, or, heaven forbid, ate salad with a single piece of cutlery. To them, that wasn't efficiency. It was anarchy. By the end of the Edwardian era, as the world teetered toward war and social upheaval, fork etiquette remained one of the few unshakable pillars of order. The empire might tremble, but the table still glittered, a last bastion of civility against the encroaching chaos of modernity. So the next time you sit before a neatly arranged table and hesitate, wondering which utensil to use, remember, you're not just dining, you're walking a historical tightrope once navigated by trembling Edwardians, and if you reach for the wrong fork, don't worry. Somewhere in the great beyond, an Edwardian butler just raised one ghostly eyebrow. Few things in Edwardian society were as perilous as the seating plan. Forget politics, forget inheritance, forget even love. Where you sat at dinner determined your destiny. It was the social map of the evening, an intricate arrangement of power, prestige, and potential humiliation. Every fork might gleam and every candle flicker. But if your name was placed near the kitchen door, congratulations, you were the human equivalent of leftovers. A dinner invitation in Edwardian Britain was not simply an invitation to eat. It was an invitation to compete. The table was an arena where rank and influence played out in polite miniature, and the hostess was the grand architect of it all. Before a single soup spoon was lifted, she had already decided who mattered, who pretended to matter, and who was only there because she needed an even number of chairs. The placement of guests was a science of staggering precision. The most honoured male guest, perhaps a duke, an admiral, or that elusive titled cousin everyone pretended to like, would be seated to the hostess's right. To her left, the second most distinguished man. Across the table, the host performed the same ritual in reverse, offering his right-hand position to the most important woman present. If you were seated beside the host or hostess, you weren't just dining, you were being publicly blessed. To occupy one of those golden seats was the Edwardian equivalent of trending socially. But position wasn't simply about flattery, it was about alliances. The hostess used her seating chart like a chessboard. Placing two powerful people beside each other could forge new friendships or financial partnerships, or, if she was feeling mischievous, create a rivalry that would keep drawing room buzzing for weeks. Guests were pawns in her elaborate social game, and she played for reputation, not mercy. The middle of the table was purgatory, respectable but forgettable. You might be liked, but you weren't newsworthy. However, the true horror lay at the far end, the place near the kitchen door, where servants entered and exited with plates, where draughts chilled the ankles, and where polite laughter went to die. Guests exiled to this region knew their fate. They smiled bravely, telling themselves they preferred quiet conversation, while secretly plotting revenge through gossip later. The Edwardians took seating politics so seriously that entire evenings could rise or fall on one misplaced guest. There are accounts of hostesses weeping before dinner, realising that they had accidentally seated a baronet above an earl's second son, or that two rival society ladies had been placed within gossiping distance. Some households even employed social secretaries, whose sole job was to memorise titles, peerage hierarchies, and ongoing feuds, ensuring no one was offended and everyone else was. At formal dinners, name cards were handwritten with elegant precision and placed just above each plate. The discovery of your position was the night's first emotional test. Guests approached the table like archaeologists examining relics, scanning for their own names and those of potential allies or enemies. A good placement could lift your spirits, a poor one could ruin your appetite. Some even took strategic detours around the table to accidentally confirm who had been seated higher. In a world obsessed with subtle hierarchies, the seating plan was a mirror of your social worth, and heaven forbid you tried to change seats. There were stories, whispered in horror, of one ambitious lady who attempted to swap her place card when the hostess wasn't looking. She was caught mid-rearrangement by the butler, who promptly reported the treason. By morning the story had reached every parlour in London. She might as well have committed regicide, but the plan wasn't just about rank, it was about conversation management. A good hostess didn't simply seat people by title, she seated them by temperament. The loud beside the quiet, the witty beside the dull, the newly rich beside someone too polite to mention it. It was a delicate balance between entertainment and disaster. The goal was to produce an evening of fluid chatter, not too raucous, not too solemn, that gave the illusion of effortless elegance. If a conversation failed at one end of the table, it reflected directly on the hostess's skill. A single bored guest could be interpreted as negligence. Even romance wasn't immune. Unmarried guests were carefully placed near suitable partners, but never too close. Decorum demanded at least 6 inches of distance and one topic of conversation approved by Mrs. Beeton. Sometimes a clever hostess engineered matches this way, pairing 2 promising young people over pudding. Sometimes she engineered feuds just to watch them play out over the roast. The seating plan was matchmaking, manipulation, and moral philosophy all in one. Of course, not everyone played along. The elderly titled elite often used their position to make the middle classes squirm. The duke might ignore his assigned conversation partner entirely, speaking instead across the table, a sin so grave it bordered on rebellion. Some guests weaponized boredom, replying to every question with a polite grunt just to remind everyone that they didn't need to be charming. Others, particularly the nouveau riche, overcompensated with enthusiasm, laughing too loudly or attempting to lead conversations, actions that made them look about as dignified as a tap-dancing goose. And what of the servants? They, as always, were the unseen chorus. The butler ensured that each course reached the highest-ranked guest first, then cascaded downward like a waterfall of social approval. The poor soul nearest the kitchen got the last plate, sometimes lukewarm, sometimes already missing a garnish. Even the temperature of your soup reflected your importance. The true irony of it all was that no one openly acknowledged the system. To mention the seating order was to break the spell. It was the great unspoken language of Edwardian civility. Cruel, brilliant, and absolutely essential. Everyone pretended not to care, even as they quietly calculated their position like accountants of vanity. When dinner finally ended, and the guests rose from their carefully curated seats, the analysis began instantly. Who was placed where? Why was he beside her? What did it mean that Lord Fitzwilliam was exiled halfway down the table? The seating plan was dissected like battlefield strategy, its social casualties counted in whispers. The night might be over, but the consequences lingered long after the candles went out. In a world where reputation was everything, your place at the table wasn't about geography, it was about destiny. The Edwardians understood that power wasn't just held in parlours or parliament, it was distributed by seating card. And as every guest knew, proximity to the soup tureen meant nothing. Proximity to influence meant everything. So if you ever find yourself reincarnated at an Edwardian dinner, pray that your name isn't near the swing door. Because no matter how fine your clothes or polished your manners, the moment you sit beside the draught and the dishes, you're not a guest anymore. You're decoration with a pulse. Ah yes, the soup spoon. A deceptively innocent-looking object, curved, shiny, and utterly treacherous. In Edwardian Britain, it was more than a utensil. It was a test of grace, a badge of class, and a silent executioner of reputations. If the first course of soup was the trial by fire, then the soup spoon was the weapon everyone feared to mishandle. Because in the great theatre of Edwardian dining, soup wasn't something you drank, it was something you auditioned for. Let's begin with the basics. Or rather what the Edwardians called the basics, which would make most modern diners weep. The soup spoon was not universal. No, that would be far too logical. There were deep-bowled spoons for consommé, shallow ones for thick soups, oval ones for broths, and, for those who took the art to extremes, a special cream soup spoon with a slightly flatter edge. To confuse matters further, the American-style spoon was round, while the English style was oval. And naturally Edwardians looked down upon the round one as provincial. A guest who confused the two might as well have announced, "I eat in railway stations." Every motion with the spoon was laden with meaning. The first and most sacred rule, scoop away, never toward. The spoon must move outward, from the diner to the far edge of the bowl, as if delicately distancing itself from vulgar hunger. Pulling the spoon toward oneself was unthinkable, practically an act of culinary desperation. A true gentleman or the lady did not pursue soup. They allowed it to come to them through patience and gravity, like opportunity. Next came the question of how to sip. Loudly, never. Quietly, absolutely. But not too quietly, Eddie. You had to make it known that you were, in fact, partaking, lest the hostess suspect you were rejecting her chef's artistry. The spoon must be brought to the lips and never into the mouth, and the liquid sipped from the side, not the point. Tilting the bowl was permitted only at the very end, and only slightly, away from oneself. Tilting the bowl toward you? That was practically bartering with the devil. The true elite could perform this ritual flawlessly, every movement choreographed down to the microsecond. They didn't simply eat soup, they conducted it. A well-trained Edwardian hand could glide a spoon through liquid with the elegance of a violin bow. To watch a duchess sip her turtle soup was to witness art. To watch a novice attempt the same thing was to witness tragedy in slow motion. Etiquette manuals devoted entire sections to the soup spoon. Some even included diagrams, as if one might forget where one's face was located. A guide from 1909 solemnly instructed, when lifting the spoon, incline it slightly downward, so that the broth may rest upon it evenly. Then carry it gracefully, without haste, toward the mouth, turning the wrist just enough to ensure silence. It's unclear whether anyone ever managed this maneuver without wrist cramps, but in the Edwardian imagination perfection was mandatory. The shape of the spoon also carried subtle social messages. Larger, deeper spoons were associated with more hearty rustic eating, appropriate for game soup or peasant fare. Small, shallow spoons, on the other hand, whispered refinement. A delicate consommé served with an oversized spoon would have been considered a moral outrage, akin to wearing muddy boots in a drawing room. And if a guest dared to use the dessert spoon instead of the soup spoon, the scandal would ripple through the table like a shockwave. Even the act of resting one's spoon between sips carried risk. Lay it across the bowl and you implied impatience. Leave it inside the soup and you risked having it slide unceremoniously into the depths, splashing your dignity. The correct method was to rest it gently upon the saucer beneath the bowl, angled diagonally, as if the spoon itself had retired from polite society for a brief rest. Servants were trained to remove bowls with spoons placed just so. Any deviation meant someone, likely the guest, didn't know the code. Hostesses, ever watchful, took note of how their guests handled this challenge. The soup course, though seemingly harmless, revealed everything. A steady hand meant breeding. A trembling hand meant nerves, or worse, new money. A guest who finished too quickly appeared gluttonous. One who lingered too long risked holding up the entire service. The ideal pace was what etiquette experts called civilly unhurried. Translation: slow enough to seem graceful, fast enough to avoid looking like you're savouring every molecule out of desperation. The servants, of course, were connoisseurs of soup etiquette. The butler's trained eye could spot the difference between natural grace and learned mimicry in an instant. Many a nervous guest tried to discreetly copy their neighbour, unaware that every hesitant motion was being mentally scored by the staff. Below stairs, after the meal, the critique began. "Lady Vinton stirred her soup twice," one footman might report. "Unthinkable." "Lord Darrington slurped," another would add. "That's his last invitation." And then there were the rebels, the guests who refused to play by the rules. One notorious incident involved a visiting American who, unaware of the sacred scoop-away doctrine, boldly drew the spoon toward himself and slurped audibly. The table froze. A duchess inhaled so sharply that her pearls nearly strangled her. The hostess smiled through her trauma, but rumour has it she changed her entire guest list for the next season out of sheer self-preservation. The story became known as the slurping scandal of 11, retold in hushed tones whenever soup was served. What made all this so delightfully absurd was the sheer seriousness of it all. The Edwardians genuinely believed that how one handled a spoon revealed one's moral vipum. Discipline, restraint, elegance, all distilled into a single utensil. Soup wasn't about hunger. It was about hierarchy. A man could govern a colony, but if he tilted his soup bowl the wrong way, his future invitations were in jeopardy. And yet, for all the pressure, the ritual had its strange beauty. It was precision as poetry, absurdity as art. The Edwardians didn't just consume food, they consumed ceremony. And perhaps, deep down, they knew the ridiculousness of it all. That's why they clung to it. Because in a world changing faster than ever, there was comfort in believing that civility could still be measured by how quietly one sipped a spoonful of soup. So yes, the soup spoon was no ordinary tool, it was a mirror, curved, polished, and merciless. One tremor of the wrist, one drop on the bedcloth, and you weren't just clumsy, you were uncivilized. And in Edwardian Britain, that was a fate far worse than hunger. If the Edwardian dinner table was a battlefield, then evening wear was the armour. No matter how delicious the menu or how perfect the silverware alignment, your social survival began long before the soup course. It began in front of the mirror. "Dress for dinner," they said, as if it were a simple request. But in Edwardian society, that phrase meant orchestrating a transformation so elaborate that even your reflection had to pause and ask who you were pretending to be tonight. Because in this glittering world of chandeliers and gossip, if your cufflinks didn't blind someone, were you even trying? For the Edwardians, dining attire wasn't about comfort, it was about performance. Every stitch, button and bead carried meaning. To appear at the table without proper dress was social suicide. The ritual was so deeply ingrained that even in private households, where the only witnesses were servants who had already seen everything, people still changed for dinner. It didn't matter if you'd spent the afternoon dodging horses or sweating through estate management. By 7:30 p.m, you emerged as a creature of refinement, bound tightly in silk satin and self-restraint. For men, the evening ensemble was a uniform of near-military precision. A black tailcoat, crisp white shirt, starched wing collar, so sharp it could cut bread, waistcoat and black bow tie, all immaculately fitted. Trousers had to have the perfect crease, shoes gleamed like obsidian, and hair was slicked with enough pomade to double as furniture polish. Gloves were mandatory until seated, at which point they were removed with a kind of practice drama, the Edwardian equivalent of unsheathing a sword. Every detail whispered, "I belong here." Any wrinkle or missed buttonhole shouted, "I am an amateur and possibly a threat to civilization." Women, of course, bore the greater burden because elegance, for them, was both an expectation and a trap. Evening gowns were architectural feats of fashion, structured with corsets that could realign one's organs in the name of beauty. Bodices were embroidered with metallic thread, beads, and lace so fine it could bankrupt a small farm. The skirts cascaded in layers of silk and chiffon, sweeping the floor like an apology. Bare shoulders were encouraged provided they were powdered, perfumed and illuminated under candlelight. A woman's dress wasn't just clothing, it was proof of effort. Accessories were no less vital. Gloves were worn almost constantly, long white ones reaching to the elbow for formal dinners. They served no practical purpose other than to announce, "I'm so refined I've never touched anything dirty in my life." Jewellery was equally strategic. Diamonds for status, pearls for purity, and tiaras for women who'd already won the social lottery. The truly daring wore coloured gemstones, a subtle way of saying I have personality and possibly land in Devon. The Edwardians believed fashion could communicate moral virtue. A well-dressed woman was respectable, a poorly dressed one was suspect. The line between elegantly modest and social catastrophe was as thin as the ribbon on her bodice. Men too faced unspoken rules. A waistcoat too bright hinted at vanity, shoes too dull hinted at despair. Even the placement of cufflinks mattered. Gold was bold, silver was tasteful, and novelty designs, say shaped like animals or sporting clubs, were a dangerous flirtation with vulgarity. The evening toilette, that's getting dressed, but fancier, could take hours. Hairdressing alone was an ordeal involving pins, pomades, and sometimes small wire frames to maintain shape. A lady's maid was indispensable, part artist, part engineer, part therapist for when the corset laces grew too tight. The result, ideally, was a look of effortless grace, achieved through considerable suffering. The goal was to appear as if one had floated down from heaven, not clawed one's way out of satin. Once dressed, the journey to the dining room became a fashion parade. Guests descended staircases like royalty, pausing just long enough for everyone to admire the shimmer of fabric and the whisper of wealth. Men escorted women by the arm, a gesture of gallantry that also conveniently prevented fainting from corset-induced oxygen deprivation. The dinner may have been about conversation, but the first few minutes were all about inspection. Before the first course was served, reputations had already been judged, ranked, and possibly ruined based on fabric choice alone. Even servants played a part in this visual symphony. Footmen wore livery so ornate they could have passed for minor nobility in the dark. Their buttons gleamed, their gloves were spotless, and their very presence reinforced the hierarchy of polish that the household demanded. A butler's subtle nod at a guest's ensemble could boost confidence for the night. A raised eyebrow could trigger an existential crisis. Fashion faux pas at dinner were the stuff of social nightmares. Imagine appearing in last season's gown, or worse, repeating an outfit someone had already seen. One lady of Mayfair reportedly had an entire wardrobe catalogued by her maid to ensure no two dresses appeared within the same circle twice. When she accidentally wore a gown she'd been photographed in at a charity ball the year before. The local paper noted it under Society Miscellany, a polite Edwardian way of saying we see your shame. And then there were the cautionary tales. One gentleman, eager to impress, arrived at dinner wearing a gleaming waistcoat of purple silk, daring, dramatic, and deeply regrettable. The colour, fashionable in Paris but scandalous in London, drew so much attention that no one heard a word he said all evening. He was henceforth known as the Violet Catastrophe. A woman in Bath suffered similar infamy for wearing jet jewellery during a dinner for a recently deceased acquaintance, jet being a mourning stone. Her timing, as society whispered, was funereal in more ways than one. Clothing, in Edwardian logic, wasn't just about beauty, it was about order. It separated the refined from the reckless, the cultured from the careless. A perfectly dressed guest reassured everyone that civilization was still intact, that the empire might waver, but fashion never faltered. It was, in its way, a collective illusion. a glittering armour against chaos. By the time the guests sat down, stiff-backed and shining, they had already completed their first battle of the evening, looking perfect. Dinner was merely the next test, and as the candles flickered against polished jewellery and glass, one truth became undeniable. No one had ever suffered so elegantly. So yes, to dine Edwardian style was to dine dressed for glory, every button fastened, every jewel gleaming, every guest privately praying that nothing slit, spilled or snapped, because beneath all the glamour one universal fear lingered at every Edwardian table, not of soup or forks or scandal, but of being remembered for the wrong outfit. For most of human history, a napkin's job was straightforward: keep the gravy off your shirt. But in Edwardian Britain, this humble piece of linen became a minefield of etiquette, a folded symbol of civilization's endless capacity to overcomplicate survival. Proper napkin use, lap, fold, down, was less about cleanliness and more about social choreography. Because at an Edwardian dinner table, the napkin wasn't for cleanliness, it was a flag of surrender to etiquette. From the moment you approached your chair, the napkin began its quiet test. The rule was deceptively simple: wait for your hostess. The instant she lifted her napkin and placed it upon her lap, you were permitted to follow suit. Move too soon, and you looked over-eager, like a child at a picnic. Move too late, and you risked appearing uncertain, a rookie in the refined world of dinner warfare. The timing was everything. In Edwardian dining, grace began not with conversation, but with synchronized fabric deployment. The napkin's placement was an art form in itself. Once seated, you were to unfold it delicately, not shake it out like a bullfighter about to challenge the soup course. Half folded, never fully open, large enough to cover the lap, but not so sprawling that it implied fear of spillage. A gentleman's napkin rested across both knees, a lady's slightly higher, as her voluminous gowns made reaching her knees a logistical impossibility. Folding it neatly was a declaration of refinement. Dropping it, however, was the social equivalent of dropping your moral compass. Napkin usage was a coded language. One did not wipe one's mouth, one dabbed. The difference between the two was the difference between civilization and chaos. Wiping implied appetite, which was a vulgar reminder that one was a creature with bodily functions. Dabbing, on the other hand, suggested restraint, purity, and the quiet suffering of someone pretending not to need soup in the first place. And the direction of the dab mattered too. Never drag the napkin across your lips. Instead, press lightly against the corners of the mouth, as if politely discouraging them from expressing too much personality. The real danger came mid-meal, when conversation demanded equal attention. A poorly timed napkin manoeuvre could sabotage your reputation entirely. Imagine mid-laughter at a witty remark. A droplet of sauce dares to escape, and in your panic you swipe instead of dab. The table stiffens. The butler's jaw tightens. You can feel your name being erased from future invitation lists. Edwardian politeness required superhuman restraint. You could starve gracefully, but you could not wipe aggressively. Placement etiquette extended beyond your lap. The napkin's final position at the end of the meal was another unspoken code. A neatly folded napkin meant you were still eating, a subtle signal to servants to leave your plate alone. A napkin placed loosely, slightly crumpled on the left side of your plate, indicated you were finished. But woe betide the guest who folded their napkin at the end of the meal, at an Edwardian custom, implied dissatisfaction, as if to say, "I shall not require your cooking again." It was the most polite way possible to commit social arson. Even the act of leaving the table mid-meal came with its own napkin ritual. If you had to excuse yourself, and truly you were supposed to endure all natural discomforts until coffee, you folded your napkin loosely and placed it on your chair, never the table. Leaving it on the table was tantamount to announcing your departure to the world, and therefore, in Edwardian logic, drawing attention to your bodily functions. In other words, you didn't leave your napkin on the table because everyone would know where you were going, and Edwardians preferred to believe no one ever did. Hostesses had opinions, strong ones, about napkin etiquette. Some favoured large damask napkins embroidered with monograms. Others preferred dainty linen squares that could barely contain a breadcrumb. The upper classes treated napkin fabric as an expression of refinement. A napkin too thick was ungraceful, too small was insufficiently genteel. Monogramming was both fashionable and dangerous. One aristocrat famously had her initials embroidered in gold thread so prominently that her guests could barely find the clean corner to dab with. The middle classes, eager to imitate their betters, took napkin etiquette to neurotic extremes. They practiced folding techniques, half-quarter, triangle, or the daunting opera fan, consulting Mrs. Beeton and Emily Post as though decoding sacred scripture. Some even staged mock dinners at home just to rehearse the proper hand movements. In an age where class mobility depended on precision, even the angle of a napkin fold could hint at one's origins. A merchant's wife might daintily dab too often. A titled lady might not touch hers at all. Moderation, as always, was the hardest art. The servants, as ever, observed with quiet amusement. They were trained to read the table's napkin signals with the accuracy of military intelligence. A dropped napkin was retrieved instantly, but if retrieved too quickly, it risked embarrassing the guest. A skilled footman waited just long enough to let the guilty party squirm, then rescued it with silent grace. In the servants' hall later, napkin mishaps became comedy gold. Her ladyship dabbed like she was scrubbing the silver, one might say, and that colonel used his like a towel at the Turkish bath. Of course, napkin etiquette extended beyond the dinner table. Afternoon tea, luncheons, and even railway dining had their own unspoken variations. Men travelling first class by train were expected to tuck a linen napkin discreetly, not under the chin. Heavens, no, but across the lap, even while the scenery blurred by. Didn't matter if the tea sloshed or the biscuit crumbled. The illusion of composure had to survive. The absurdity of it all was that no one truly knew why these rules existed, only that they did, and must be obeyed. The napkin was civilization made visible, a soft white symbol of self-control. The Edwardians clung to it because it represented the one thing they feared losing: composure. When everything else trembled, the economy, the colonies, the rising middle class, at least their napkins remained folded. By the end of the meal, when conversation had softened and dessert was long gone, the guests would gently place their napkins aside, signalling the close of the night's performance. The dining room, once a battlefield of linen and manners, settled into peace again. And as the servants swept away the remnants of the feast, the true irony remained, that all this effort, this choreography, this desperate grace, had nothing to do with cleanliness at all. In Edwardian society, a napkin wasn't meant to protect your clothes. It was meant to protect your reputation. If the Edwardian table was a battlefield of forks and fish knives, then conversation was the verbal artillery, and one misplaced remark could blow up an entire evening. Talking wasn't just expected, it was regulated. Every syllable was weighed, every pause strategic. Because in this glittering age of chandeliers and champagne, you weren't merely expected to eat like a civilized person, you were expected to speak like one. Talk too much, vulgar, stay silent, mysterious. Laugh at your own joke, uninvited next time. Edwardian dinner conversation operated under a set of unwritten laws that could make modern diplomacy look relaxed. The first and most sacred rule was that no one talked to just anyone. Conversation like seating was dictated by rank. During the first course, you spoke to the person on your right. During the second, you turned to your left. You did not skip ahead, double back, or, heaven forbid, address someone across the Bible. Shouting over a centrepiece of lilies was considered a war crime against civility. The entire evening was a delicate waltz of alternating attention, designed to ensure that everyone felt spoken to, but never too much. The hostess, of course, was the conductor of this conversational symphony. She began the first note, often with a gentle question or a carefully chosen anecdote designed to loosen the guest's vocal cords without igniting scandal. A skilled hostess could set the tone for the evening's talk with the precision of a playwright. Light, amusing, and inoffensive, as one etiquette manual advised, but never frivolous, gossipy, or self-congratulatory. In other words, she had to make everyone feel brilliant while saying nothing of substance herself, a task requiring saintly patience and occasional wine. The list of forbidden topics was impressive. Politics, religion, illness, death, money, trade, and, most ironically, food. Discussing what you were eating while you were eating it was considered crass, as if you were acknowledging the mechanics of digestion. One might compliment the cook in passing, but not the meat. The only truly safe subjects were art, travel, the weather, theatre, dogs, and vague compliments about someone's garden. The real geniuses could sustain an entire evening on the weather alone, layering adjectives like social armour. To make things even more traureras, conversation had to sound effortless, as though one were born speaking in perfectly balanced witticisms. Edwardians prized graceful spontaneity, which is to say they spent all afternoon rehearsing lines that sounded unrehearsed. Men were expected to be gently humorous without descending into vulgarity, women to be charming without being too clever. God forbid intelligence interrupt the souffle. A lady who dominated the table's attention was considered forward. A man who failed to speak at all was dull. Everyone else lived in terror of being both. Silences were particularly dangerous. Too short and you risked seeming overeager. Too long and you implied awkwardness, or worse, judgment. The truly gifted conversationalist could fill pauses with soothing murmurs and transitions so seamless you never noticed how little was actually said. They were the social magicians of their time, making nothing sound like everything. The great enemy of Edwardian conversation, however, was laughter. Specifically laughter that came from the wrong source. Gentle amusement was allowed, a soft chuckle, an approving smile, but anything louder than a restrained ha threatened to topple the delicate illusion of composure. To laugh uproariously was to confess to a lack of resolve. To laugh at your own joke was social suicide. Even smiling too often risked branding you as unserious, or worse, American. The ideal expression was perpetual mild amusement, as though life were a long-running play that you understood perfectly but were far too polite to critique. Guests who failed to navigate this verbal minefield became cautionary tales. One hapless merchant, newly invited to high society, once made the mistake of discussing his business over dinner. "We had a good quarter," he boasted proudly. The table fell silent. The hostess blinked as if struck by lightning. Within days, the poor man's reputation had been reduced to ash. Talking about money you actually earned was tantamount to indecency. You could inherit wealth, spend it or lose it romantically in a duel, but you could not discuss its origin. That was trade talk, and trade was as unwelcome as hiccups. Then there were the conversational overachievers, guests who mistook volume for wit. They dominated discussions, interrupted dukes, and laughed at their own stories until the crystal rattled. Hostesses dreaded them. They were seated strategically at the far ends of tables, as if distance could dilute their enthusiasm. But even there, their booming voices carried across the room, offending delicate sensibilities and frightening the soup. Their invitations tended to dry up mysteriously soon after. Servants, ever the silent observers, took a particular delight in the evening's verbal theatre. While gliding between chairs with plates and decanters, they listened to every word, their faces expressionless masks of professionalism. But below stairs, the verdicts were swift. "The colonel spoke of fox hunting again," one footman might mutter. "He'll die with no one to listen." Or, "Lady Wren laughed so hard she startled the pudding." For the servants, the dinner table's forced civility was entertainment of the highest order. Even complimenting one's host required careful verbal choreography. A charming evening was safe, a delightful meal acceptable. The soup was divine risky. It implied you were judging the food instead of the company. A simple "my compliments to the cook" might sound harmless, but to a touchy hostess, it suggested the meal's success was due to someone else. Edwardian speech was a maze of double meanings where even gratitude could be weaponized. And yet, for all the rigidity, there was real artistry in the best Edwardian conversation. The masters of talk, men like Winston Churchill in his youth, or the salon hostesses of Mayfair, turned etiquette into theatre. Their conversations sparkled with innuendo, wit, and irony so finely balanced that even scandalous jokes passed as sophistication. The most dazzling guests weren't those who shocked, but those who hinted. A clever insinuation was worth 10 direct statements. When dessert arrived and the talk softened, the hostess would cast her final glance down the table. Were her guests still smiling? Were there no silences, no sulks, no accidental references to the Boer War? Success. The evening had survived the curse of conversation. As the guest departed, compliments were exchanged, reputations recalibrated, and the host's relief carefully disguised as charm. But everyone knew the truth. Edwardian dining wasn't just about eating. It was about enduring a 3-hour conversation while pretending to enjoy it. And so they left, smiling, exhausted, and quietly thankful that they had neither talked too much, nor too little, nor laughed at their own joke. Because in Edwardian Britain, your words weren't just conversation. They were your curriculum vitae. In Edwardian Britain, dinner wasn't just about food or etiquette. It was a meticulously staged performance of gender. Every course reinforced a social script older than the silver on the table. Men carved, women smiled, and both tried not to die of boredom before dessert. The table may have glittered with crystal and candlelight, but beneath the surface lay a quiet choreography of power, politeness, and mutual endurance. At first glance, the Edwardian dinner seemed to promise equality. Men and women seated side by side, sharing conversation, wine, and laughter. But appearances were the first lie of the evening. From the moment they sat down, each knew their part by heart. Men were expected to lead the conversation, pour the wine, and perform the gentle arrogance of command. Women, meanwhile, were required to be the decorative equilibrium of the event. Beautiful, charming, and perpetually agreeable, like living centerpieces who occasionally spoke. The unwritten rule was that men handled the action, women handled the atmosphere. A gentleman might carve the roast with practiced precision, because no one trusted a lady with a knife that large, while his female neighbour kept the tone of the table buoyant with perfectly timed nods and smiles. Men discussed history, travel, and parliament. Women asked questions, admired wit, and crucially never seemed too informed. Intelligence was attractive, but only if it came dressed in modesty. Too much insight risked being labelled masculine. Too little, and one was insipid. The line between fascination and foolishness was as fine as a thread of lace. Even laughter had gendered rules. Men could laugh heartily, the sound of confidence and good breeding. Women's laughter, on the other hand, was to be melodic, restrained, and above all brief. Guffaws were for men, giggles were for girls. A lady who laughed too loudly risked being branded forward. A man who laughed too softly risked being accused of dullness. And since Edwardian society was built almost entirely on avoiding accusations, dinner often sounded like an orchestra of politely stifled amusement. The gender divide extended to the topics of conversation as well. Men talked politics, empire, horses, and the occasional war story. Women were confined to gardens, art, fashion, and the weather, the conversational equivalent of decorative wallpaper. If a woman dared express a strong opinion, say about suffrage or social reform, she did so at her own peril. There's an infamous story of an ambitious hostess who invited a known suffragist to dinner in 1911. When the woman mentioned votes for women between the fish and the pheasant, the table froze. Her neighbour, a retired colonel, dropped his fork in horror. Someone coughed loudly to fill the silence. Within minutes, the hostess changed the subject to orchids. Everyone exhaled. Disaster narrowly averted. Of course, men weren't entirely free either. Their charm had to be carefully measured. A man who flirted too boldly was a rake, too timidly a bore. A well-bred gentleman walked the conversational tightrope of being engaging without being improper. Compliments were currency, but they had to be subtle. "You have exquisite taste in brooches" was acceptable. "You look ravishing tonight" was a duel waiting to happen. After dinner, the script became even more absurdly choreographed. When the main meal ended, the hostess would give a delicate nod, and the ladies would rise as one, leaving the men to their cigars, port, and politics. This ritual, known as the withdrawal, was performed with military precision. The women, graceful as swans, glided from the room in a cloud of perfume and suppressed sighs, while the men leaned back in their chairs with visible relief, as though liberated from captivity. In the drawing room, the women reassembled into a quieter theatre of endurance. They discussed opera, acquaintances, and occasionally, in whispers, their husbands. Tea was served, accompanied by small cakes and large silences. The air smelled of violets and faint resentment. The hostess, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to keep the mood light, maintaining the illusion that the women were enjoying themselves. Downstairs, the footmen and maids would exchange knowing looks. They'd seen this pantomime 100 times. Back in the dining room, the men's gathering was the unspoken after-party. Freed from polite restraint, they loosened their collars, poured heavier drinks, and swapped stories of sport and empire. Conversation became louder, rougher, and distinctly more self-congratulatory. Politics returned to the table like an old drinking companion. Jokes, the kind unfit for drawing rooms, made their rounds. It was a brief, boisterous rebellion against the velvet tyranny of civility. This post-dinner gender split wasn't just habit, it was ideology. Edwardian society believed that men and women inhabited different mental planets, and dinner was designed to reinforce the orbit. Men were rational, worldly, and capable of debate. Women were emotional, ornamental, and responsible for moral grace. The table itself was a microcosm of the empire's hierarchy, men ruling with port glasses in hand, women maintaining the illusion of stability through smiles. Yet beneath this decorum, cracks were forming. By the early 1910s, the world outside the dining room was changing. Suffragettes chained themselves to railings, women entered universities, and factories began hiring female workers. The polite world of ladies first was starting to look outdated, but inside the dining rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia, nothing had changed. The ritual carried on, stubborn and glittering, like a chandelier that refused to notice the lights of modernity outside. Ironically, the only people truly comfortable with this arrangement were the servants. They saw through the performance completely. The butler could tell which husbands despised their wives, which wives despised their roles, and which guests despised everyone. Below stairs, they joked that gentlemen smoke lies, and ladies sip truth. They were probably right. When the men finally joined the women in the drawing room, the atmosphere would shift once again, an awkward merging of two parallel worlds. The ladies' subdued tea talk collided with the men's smoky exuberance. The room filled with forced laughter, polite inquiries, and one collective thought pulsing behind every eye. When will it be acceptable to leave? For all its elegance, the Edwardian dinner revealed an empire built not just on class, but on gendered exhaustion. The men performed confidence, the women performed composure. Both were trapped in a ritual of manners so rigid it bordered on tragicomedy. And while dessert might have offered sweetness, it was rarely enough to mask the bitterness of pretending that everyone at the table was exactly where they wanted to be. So yes, men carved, women smiled, and both endured the theatre of civility with the patience of saints and the enthusiasm of prisoners. By the end of the night, their faces ached from polite expressions, their spirits weighed down by the unspoken truth of Edwardian life, that even in the glow of chandeliers, half the guests were still eating in the dark. If you've wanted to understand Edwardian society, you didn't need to study politics or peerage roles, you just needed to read a menu. Every meal was a mirror reflecting class, not just what people ate, but how they pretended to eat. The rich dined on extravagance, the middle class tried to fake it, and the poor quietly wondered what it all tasted like. In this delicate social ecosystem, survival wasn't about calories, it was about appearances. After all, if you couldn't afford caviar, you just renamed eggs with confidence. For the aristocracy, dining wasn't nourishment, it was theatre. Performed nightly under chandeliers the size of carriages. Meals were multi-act productions, each course a display of wealth disguised as refinement. Turtle soup, salmon in aspic, roast pheasant, venison, soufflés, and endless sauces, all presented by servants trained to move as silently as ghosts. The food itself mattered less than its impression. The goal was to eat like a person who never needed to eat again. The wealthy measured their meals not in portions but in prestige. Imported delicacies were currency. Russian caviar, French truffles, Italian wines, pineapples shipped from colonies. Even ice imported from Norway before electric refrigeration became fashionable. The more absurd the source, the greater the status. If a dish required a footman to explain where it came from, you were eating correctly. An Edwardian host once famously served a course of nightingale tongues in jelly, not because anyone wanted to eat that, but because no one else could afford to. Meanwhile, the middle classes, freshly minted from the industrial boom, were trapped in the most exhausting performance of all, imitation. Their dinners were ambitious affairs, smaller rooms, fewer servants, but the same desperate desire to impress. Every social climber's table groaned under the weight of borrowed grandeur. If the rich dined on lobster, the middle class served crab and called it local lobster. If the rich drank champagne, they opened fizzy white wine and prayed no one could tell the difference. And if they couldn't afford caviar, well, boiled eggs finely chopped and served on toast could be christened mock caviar, with enough self-belief. Cookbooks and etiquette manuals fueled this culinary mimicry. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management became the middle-class Bible of respectability, offering recipes that let readers simulate nobility on a budget. Her chapters were filled with titles like A Simple Dinner for 8, Without Disgrace, and Economical Suppers for the Aspirational. The idea was simple. Feed your guests without revealing your income. Because in Edwardian society, nothing said upstart like being caught with a menu that was too plain. But the strain of pretending to dine like the elite was monumental. Aspiring hostesses worked themselves into breakdowns planning elaborate multi-course meals they could barely afford. A dinner party might consume an entire month's household budget, but failure was unthinkable. Guests judged every bite, every garnish, every spoon placement. Serving soup from a tureen instead of bowls marked you as tasteful. Serving soup that was lukewarm marked you as doomed. The working classes watched this performance from afar, sometimes literally, as cooks, maids, or footmen ferrying dishes they'd never taste. While the elite dissected the relative merits of quail versus grouse, the people preparing those birds were lucky to dine on bread and dripping. In poorer households, dinner wasn't a display, it was a negotiation between hunger and pennies. Yet even there, aspiration existed. Servants picked up habits from their employers, a way to fold a napkin, the pronunciation of soufflé, and passed them along to their own families, creating tiny echoes of refinement in the most unlikely corners of London. The rich, of course, maintained their dominance through sheer waste. A noble dinner table was an ecosystem of extravagance. Half-eaten roasts, mountains of uneaten fruit, desserts no one touched. Leftovers fed the servants, a system known as perquisites or perks. Some maids quietly thrived on the cast-offs of high society, though the butler often claimed the choicest portions. Below stairs, the scraps of luxury became folklore. The Viscount didn't finish his pudding was news worth gossiping about. Dining also revealed class through pace and posture. The upper classes ate slowly, as though bored by the concept of nourishment. They held their forks delicately, took small bites, and appeared faintly annoyed that food required effort. The middle classes, still learning the art of performance, sometimes struggled to keep up, or, more accurately, to slow down. Many an ambitious dinner guest was outed not by their accent, but by how efficiently they finished the meat course. Nothing screamed self-made like visible enthusiasm for food. And while the wealthy hired French chefs to create culinary masterpieces, the middle class employed cooks, women who often relied more on intuition than recipes. These cooks worked miracles with limited means, producing fancy dishes on modest stoves and tight budgets. But the real secret weapon of the middle-class dinner was presentation. The Edwardians adored spectacle. Food was moulded, jellied, stacked and glazed, until it resembled edible architecture. Even a humble ham could be transformed into a symbol of gentility with enough parsley garnish. Then there were the truly extravagant, the upper crust, who lived in a constant competition to outdine one another. These were the people who installed electric lights solely to make their food sparkle, who hosted 12-course banquets just because their rivals only hosted 10. Some even employed menu poets, writers hired to translate ordinary dishes into florid French, so that roast beef became rosbif à la grandeur anglaise. Because in Edwardian England, English food wasn't good enough until it sounded foreign. But beneath all the glitter and gastronomy, the truth was simple. Food was power. To eat lavishly meant to exist above consequence. The poor worried about survival, the rich worried about seasoning. Every plate was a proclamation of control over servants, over imports, over hunger itself. Still, even the grandest tables couldn't escape irony. As the middle class strained to imitate the upper, and the upper strained to impress one another, no one seemed to enjoy the meal. The rich nibbled to avoid appearing greedy, the aspiring starved themselves to fund the feast, and the servants, the only ones who truly hungered, waited downstairs. So yes, Edwardian Britain was a food chain, but not the kind nature intended. It was built not on appetite, but on anxiety. Each class fed on the one below it, in coin, in labour, in crumbs. And at the very top, beneath the candlelight and cut crystal, sat those who had everything except the one thing the poor still possessed, the honest pleasure of a good meal. While the upper classes spent their evenings conducting silent wars with soup spoons and fish knives, the working class of Edwardian Britain looked on with a mixture of fascination, confusion and mild contempt. To them, fine dining etiquette was not so much a sign of civilization as a sign that the wealthy had run out of problems. They ate with one fork and 10 fingers, and slept better for it. In the cramped terraces of London, Manchester or Liverpool, dinner was not an event. It was a necessity. Families crowded around rough wooden tables, sometimes no bigger than a breadboard, with meals served directly from one pot. The idea of 12 different utensils for 12 different courses would have been met with the kind of laughter reserved for fairy tales. A single sturdy fork, often shared, sometimes bent, occasionally missing a tine, did the work of an entire silver army. And if the fork wasn't available, well, fingers were God's original cutlery. This wasn't sloppiness, it was practicality. The working class didn't need to impress anyone at supper. Dinner was eaten after 10 hours in a factory, not after 10 hours of pretending not to notice the soup temperature. Their table manners were governed by function. Eat while it's hot, don't waste food, and leave enough for tomorrow. Knife and fork etiquette, as the wealthy defined it, had little meaning in a world where a blunt knife had to double as a hammer. And spoons were used for everything from porridge to pudding. Still, even the poorest Edwardians were acutely aware of the social codes surrounding dining. Newspapers, etiquette manuals and overheard gossip from upstairs filtered down into the streets, where people treated these customs with equal parts awe and amusement. Working-class papers occasionally ran mock articles lampooning upper-class dining, how to eat soup without drowning, or on the proper introduction of fork to mouth. They understood that the upper classes weren't eating, they were performing, and every performance looked faintly ridiculous when you were watching from the cheap seats. Yet the divide wasn't purely cynical. Many working-class families aspired to a version of refinement, a simplified imitation of the rituals they saw in shop windows or Sunday papers. Pawn shops often displayed second-hand silverware, and an ambitious mother might buy a set of mismatched forks and spoons, dreaming of a respectable Sunday dinner. The practice of laying a tablecloth, even a worn or stained one, became a symbol of dignity, a small declaration that they too could dine properly, even if the meal was bread, onions and tea. For those employed as servants in wealthy homes, the relationship with etiquette was more complex. They enforced the very rules they secretly mocked. A maid might spend her morning polishing 12 types of forks, only to eat her own meal later, with a spoon that had seen better centuries. They knew every rule, which side of the plate the oyster fork sat on when the soup spoon should vanish, how to fold napkins into swans, but they also knew how arbitrary it all was. Below stairs, laughter often broke out over the absurdities of the upstairs world. The master can't slice a loaf, but he lectures on carving, one kitchen maid reportedly quipped. For working men, table etiquette was often viewed as a kind of moral trap. In pubs and workhouses, forks were optional, but honesty was mandatory. There was a certain pride in not knowing which utensil to use, proof that one was too busy earning a living to care. This pride bordered on mockery. If a man knew too much about napkins or spoons, he might be teased as putting on airs. For them, food was about fuel, not theatre. The rich ate to be admired, the poor ate to stay alive. Still, small hints of upper-class influence crept into working-class dining as the century turned. The spread of affordable enamel plates, metal cutlery, and factory-made table linens began to democratise dining. Tea sets, once a mark of wealth, appeared in modest homes thanks to mass production. By the Edwardian era, even the humblest households had a cup and saucer reserved for company. Refinement was trickling down, not because people believed in it, but because they wanted a piece of the illusion, and perhaps the dignity it promised. In industrial towns, newly literate workers read etiquette columns the way modern people scroll social media, with curiosity, envy, and a hint of derision. A factory girl might read about the proper method of addressing a duchess, while stirring her stew and think quite reasonably, if the duchess wants stew, she can learn my method. The moral geography of class was clear. The rich worried about appearance, the poor worried about rent, and yet, even as they mocked the pretensions of the upper crust, there was a strange satisfaction in knowing the rules, if only to break them with confidence. The humour of the working class often targeted the futility of refinement. Street performers and satirical sketch artists parodied aristocrats fumbling with too many forks, or gentlemen so constrained by manners they could barely eat. The most popular characters in Edwardian music halls were the Cockney philosopher, or charwoman sage, working-class heroes who saw through the nonsense of social hierarchy. Their message was simple: they've got the silver, but we've got the sense. Food itself became symbolic of class difference. The upper classes dined on birds you couldn't pronounce. The lower classes ate whatever flew into the stew pot. But while the elite talked endlessly about flavour, the poor talked about satisfaction. There's a documented joke from a London cabman around 1905. I can't tell the difference between pheasant and chicken, but chicken doesn't make you nervous about the bill. What's remarkable is how the two worlds rarely met at the same table. When they did, usually at large civic events or charitable dinners, the culture clash was immediate. The poor ate heartily, the rich ate carefully, and both watched the other with disbelief. A journalist at one such event wrote, "It is curious to see hunger and manners sharing the same bread." In the end, the working class's view of upper-class dining was perfectly balanced between admiration and mockery. They respected the Polish, but distrusted the purpose. They didn't envy the fear that came with too many forks, too many rules, too many eyes watching. Because for all the glitter of high society, the truth remained. In the slums, people might have eaten with 1 fork and 10 fingers, but they also laughed louder, slept harder, and didn't need a manual to tell them when dinner was over. If the Edwardian dinner table was a battlefield of etiquette, dessert was the final ambush. You'd survived the soup, conquered the roast, endured the conversation, and miraculously remembered which fork was for fish. But then came the last course, deceptively sweet and full of danger. Sweets brought not relaxation, but renewed panic. Because in Edwardian Britain, dessert wasn't just pudding, it was a test of precision. And the tools of the trade, tiny, specialised and designed by sadists in silver. Dessert forks looked like someone had melted down a trident and lost interest halfway. By the time dessert arrived, the air of polite exhaustion hung thick over the table. Guests had been sitting perfectly upright for hours, corsets and collars tightening by the minute, pretending that indigestion was a concept for other classes. Yet now, as the footman cleared the last of the meat and replaced the plates with delicate porcelain trimmed in gold, everyone knew the truth. The worst was not over. The dessert course was coming, and with it the terrifying question of utensil selection. Dessert in the Edwardian sense didn't just mean sweet things. It was an elaborate postscript to the meal, a procession of fruits, creams, pastries and cheeses, each with its own precise method of consumption. There were dessert knives, dessert forks, dessert spoons, and occasionally, just to keep everyone awake, a dessert server or even a fruit scoop. The upper classes could deploy more silverware for a peach than the working class owned in total. Each piece was a trap. The dessert fork, smaller and flatter than the dinner fork, had one side widened or even serrated, because apparently slicing strawberries was too violent an act for a normal knife. The dessert knife, light and delicate, was often paired with a spoon, though no one could quite agree on why. Manuals insisted that certain fruit should be eaten with both utensils at once, using the knife to guide the morsel onto the fork, a maneuver requiring surgeon-level coordination. One wrong move and your cream puff would catapult into your neighbour's pudding, dooming you to polite exile. Even identifying which utensil was yours required expertise. After multiple courses, the table looked like a glittering scrapyard. The rule, start from the outside and work in, worked fine until dessert arrived, when suddenly servants appeared with new utensils and rearranged everything. Some guests tried to look confident, pretending to know exactly which trident fragment was intended for trifle. Others froze mid-reach, feigning interest in conversation until someone else made the first move. It was survival by observation. And then there were the fruits, deceptively elegant, deceptively evil. Grapes, oranges, apple, and pears were all served whole, on china so fragile it trembled when you breathed near it. To eat fruit properly was a nightmare of etiquette. You were to use the dessert knife to peel the skin, without holding the fruit in your hand, of course, then slice it into pieces, and finally transfer each to your mouth with a fork. Peaches, apricots and cherries were even worse. The pits had to be discreetly deposited onto your fork, then placed onto the edge of your plate without clinking. One wrong clatter, and every monocle at the table would swivel toward you. Pastries and puddings, though theoretically safer, came with their own perils. Custards, mousses and jellies jiggled at exactly the wrong moments. The proper Edwardian diner could scoop up a wobbly spoonful of blancmange without disturbing the architecture of the dish, a feat of restraint few achieved. The untrained risked chasing slippery sweets across the plate like desperate anglers. Even ice cream, that most innocent of desserts, was dangerous. If you ate it too quickly, you looked greedy. Too slowly, it melted into a shameful puddle. Then came the ritual of the finger bowl, that small lemon-scented trap that humiliated more guests than any fork ever could. Finger bowls were presented after fruit filled with warm water and a floating petal. Their purpose was simple, to rinse your fingertips discreetly. Their danger was immense. Many a well-meaning guest, unaware of the custom, mistook them for soup or tea. Entire careers of social climbing ended with that single sip. One legend tells of a middle-class merchant's wife who, in a moment of nervous confusion, drank her finger bowl clean and was never invited to dine in polite society again. She moved to Bath shortly thereafter. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on observers. Satirical magazines like Punch delighted in mocking dessert discipline, publishing cartoons of trembling diners armed with too many spoons. Even servants found the spectacle amusing. The butler, the true arbiter of the household, could always tell who came from money and who came from ambition by how they handled their pudding. Those who had been raised in luxury cut pears as calmly as surgeons. Those who hadn't wrestled them like beasts of the orchard. Yet despite the chaos, dessert remained the highlight of the Edwardian feast, the grand finale, the edible fireworks display. This was where the chef truly flaunted skill and excess. Towers of meringue glistened under gaslight. Moulded jellies quivered in jewel tones, and cakes appeared so ornate they seemed sinful to eat. The rich treated sweets as sculpture, rarely finishing them but always admiring the craftsmanship. The middle class, eager to impress, copied the form if not the flavour. Mock trifle, imitation charlotte, and faux cream made from flour and hope were staples of the aspirational pantry. The irony was that by the time dessert arrived, no one was hungry. The upper class had spent so much energy remembering rules that appetite was long dead. The course existed purely for ceremony, to end the evening on a glittering sugar-coated sigh. Guests nibbled politely, murmured appreciation, and prayed nothing stuck to their teeth. In the end, the dessert course was the perfect symbol of Edwardian excess, beautiful, delicate, and faintly absurd. The more intricate the dish, the less anyone actually ate it. The more specialised the utensil, the less anyone dared to use it. It wasn't about taste, it was about triumph. To survive dessert without embarrassment was to emerge victorious from the gauntlet of manners. And so the Edwardian diner, weary but undefeated, would place their final fork down and exhale quietly. Another evening survived. Another battle won. The fruit was peeled, the cream subdued, the finger bowl undrunk. Civilization for now had prevailed. No matter how elegant the evening or how glittering the chandeliers, every Edwardian dinner shared one unspoken rule. Never, under any circumstances, let it show that something had gone wrong. The soup could be lava, the roast could be raw, your corset could be strangling your lungs, but the performance must go on. The Edwardian ideal of refinement wasn't just about knowing which fork to use, it was about maintaining composure while your dignity, your digestion, and occasionally your consciousness slipped quietly into crisis. If you coughed, fainted, or died, you did it discreetly. This unrelenting demand for composure was drilled into the upper classes from birth. A true gentleman or lady was expected to display what the Victorians had called sang-froid, literally, cold blood. It meant staying calm when chaos erupted, smiling through disaster, and treating catastrophe as an inconvenient draught. If your glass shattered, your sleeve caught fire, or a passing servant dropped an entire tureen of soup into your lap, you didn't flinch. You offered a small, forgiving smile, the kind that said, "This is fine, everything is fine, civilization is fine," and continued as though being basted in consommé was simply part of the entertainment. For women, the challenge was doubled. A lady's worth was measured not just in beauty, but in composure under siege. The corset alone made this a heroic pursuit. Imagine sitting through a 5-course meal while your internal organs were politely rearranging themselves, all the while smiling as if blissfully unaware that breathing had become a privilege. Fainting was, in theory, permissible, but only if done elegantly. A graceful collapse onto the nearest gentleman's arm could be excused as delicate sensitivity. But if you fainted near the soup, you risked being remembered as the lady who drowned in the consommé. Gentlemen, meanwhile, were expected to be unflappable to the point of absurdity. Spilled wine? Ignore it. Sauce on your cuff? Pretend it's embroidery. Knife slips into the floorboards? Retrieve it casually as if testing the carpet's density. Even choking was to be handled with tact, a discreet cough, a quick sip of water, and above all, no panic. To stand up gasping was unthinkable. To attract attention, unforgivable. Better to perish in silence than make a scene. The Edwardians believed deeply that dignity was more important than oxygen. The great paradox was that everyone knew disaster was inevitable. Cutlery slipped, glasses tipped, and conversation stumbled. The dinner table was a minefield of potential humiliation. The only thing that mattered was how one reacted. The golden rule, pretend nothing happened. A servant could trip and scatter hors d'oeuvres like confetti, and the guests would stare serenely into the middle distance, as though it were all a part of a modern art display. The host, smiling tightly, would murmur, "Ah, how amusing." while privately recalculating the butler's severance package. Some etiquette manuals even included crisis instructions. Debrett's advised, should one drop a utensil never reach beneath the table, allow a servant to replace it. Continue your conversation unbroken. For wine spills, if wine is spilt upon one's attire, a gentle dab of the napkin suffices. Excessive scrubbing implies awareness. And, for the truly tragic scenario of accidental choking, one should excuse oneself with grace, never alarm the table, and if one must expire, do so without disrupting service. In Edwardian etiquette, death itself was acceptable, noise was not. Every dinner had its disasters, and each birthed its legends. One story often whispered with horrified delight told of Lady Alveston, who sneezed so violently during a dinner in 1909 that her pearl necklace snapped and scattered into the soup tureen. Not a soul flinched. Guests calmly continued their meal as servants discreetly fished out the pearls between courses. The hostess later remarked, "It was a most civil evening, not one pearl was acknowledged." Another famous incident involved a certain Lord Pembridge, who, while carving a pheasant, launched an entire drumstick into the lap of a visiting duchess. The room froze. Without missing a beat, the duchess picked up the bird, placed it neatly on her plate, and said, "I do admire a man who serves with enthusiasm." The table roared with laughter, the tension broke, and Lord Pembridge's reputation survived, proof that humour, when used sparingly, could rescue even poultry-based catastrophes. Servants, of course, were the unseen heroes of composure. Trained to remain expressionless no matter what horror unfolded, they could witness a pudding collapse, a guest swoon, or a child projectile vomit onto the carpet without blinking. The butler, in particular, embodied the art of denial. He didn't see mistakes, he erased them from existence. If a dish shattered, it had never been there. If a guest spilled champagne, it had simply sparkled beyond expectation. Yet for all their polished restraint, Edwardian diners lived in quiet terror. Beneath every polite smile was the fear of becoming a story. The woman whose necklace fell into the pudding, the man whose monocle popped into his port, the guest who laughed so suddenly that sherry exited through his nose. These weren't just embarrassing, they were career-ending. In a world where reputation was currency, one badly timed sneeze could bankrupt your social prospects. But perhaps the most exhausting part of all was the emotional repression. Genuine reactions, surprise, frustration, amusement, were dangerous luxuries. The Edwardians prided themselves on never appearing moved by anything, even joy. The ideal dinner guest was a statue with conversational abilities. Passion was for poets, panic was for peasants. One was expected to be composed even in triumph. You could win a game, secure a marriage proposal, or narrowly avoid death by oyster poisoning. And all you could do was smile faintly and murmur, "How lovely." It's easy now to laugh at their stiffness, the people who feared coughing more than cholera, but the Edwardian obsession with composure reveals something deeper. They lived in a world built on illusion, that the empire was stable, that manners could replace morality, that dignity could save one from disaster. Pretending to be fine was not just etiquette, it was survival. So as the final course ended and the guests rose, stiff but smiling, each one carried the same silent victory. I made it through another dinner without dying visibly. The servants bowed, the music swelled, and the performance drew to a close. No one spoke of the spilled wine, the burnt soufflé, or the man who briefly stopped breathing during the pheasant. Because in Edwardian Britain, the highest art of all wasn't conversation or carving or etiquette. It was the sacred ability to look tragedy in the face and sip your tea as though nothing had happened. If Edwardian dinner etiquette was already an Olympic sport of anxiety, then inviting foreigners turned it into the decathlon of social panic. The French brought flair, the Americans brought volume, and the British brought panic. Because nothing tested the fragile poise of Edwardian dining like someone from abroad, someone who didn't know that soup was to be scooped away, not toward or that smiling too much was practically indecent. It was civilization meeting its greatest enemy, enthusiasm. To the Edwardian host or hostess, the international guest was both a prize and a problem. A visiting diplomat, a continental count, or, heaven help them, an American heiress, could elevate a dinner's prestige overnight. But prestige came with peril. The British prided themselves on being the guardians of correctness, and yet they were painfully aware that the French had invented refinement, the Italians had mastered charm, and the Americans had commercialized confidence. So every invitation came with the same quiet prayer. Please, let them not eat the peas with a knife. The French were perhaps the most baffling to their British hosts. To the French, dining was art, sensual, expressive, alive. To the British, it was a choreographed act of quiet suffering. The French laughed too loudly, gestured with forks, and expressed delight with phrases that sounded alarmingly like romance. They seasoned conversation the way they seasoned food, liberally. At one Edwardian dinner in Belgravia, a French count reportedly exclaimed over the roast, "Magnifique! It sings of garlic." The hostess nearly fainted. The word garlic had not been uttered in her house since 1893. The French also committed the unforgivable sin of enjoying their food. They closed their eyes while tasting, praised sauces mid-bite, and even, brace yourself, requested seconds. To the British, who treated eating as a dignified endurance test, this was borderline indecent. A duke's wife once whispered to her neighbour, after watching a prison diplomat sop up gravy with bread, "It's like dining with a poet. One never knows what he'll do next." And yet the British couldn't help but envy French ease. Their guests spoke without fear, gestured without restraint, and seemed immune to the constant dread of being judged. When a Frenchman dropped his fork, he simply laughed and requested another. When a Briton did the same, he mentally rewrote his will. Then there were the Americans, loud, confident, and tragically unafraid of small talk. They smiled too much, laughed too freely, and spoke to everyone, even those they weren't seated beside. They committed conversational heresy. The American guest treated a British dinner like a networking event, breezing past centuries of unspoken rules with the cheerful efficiency of a person who had never read Debrett's. To make matters worse, American women were fearless. They didn't just speak, they spoke back. They debated politics, praised the suffragettes, and asked questions no British hostess wanted to answer. Like, "So tell me, do you actually like this soup?" One Boston heiress, attending a dinner in Mayfair, horrified her neighbours by buttering her roll with enthusiasm and declaring, "Best thing I've eaten since New York." The silence that followed was so heavy it could have sunk a ship. American men, meanwhile, had the audacity to call people by their first names. They treated dukes as if they were old college friends and countesses as if they were slightly fancier cousins. To the British, this was both shocking and oddly fascinating. Their casual informality felt like heresy, and yet, deep down, a few secretly admired it. As one London hostess wrote in her diary after a dinner with American guests, "They are intolerable and absolutely wonderful." Other nationalities added their own flavours of chaos. Italians spoke with their hands, nearly decapitating nearby guests with animated gestures. Germans took the wine list as a challenge to national honour. Russians insisted on toasts between courses, leaving half the table tipsy before dessert. Even the Japanese envoys, admired for their restraint, caused confusion by bowing at the wrong moments. Or perhaps the British bowed wrong. No one was quite sure. The empire prided itself on understanding the world, but the dinner table revealed just how fragile that illusion truly was. Servants, of course, bore witness to every cultural collision. They watched with a mixture of horror and glee as the world's finest manners collided like carriages on a foggy street. "Foreigners," the butler might mutter, "have too much fun with food." In the servants' hall later, tales were retold with relish. The Frenchman dipped bread in his sauce. The American lady spoke before the hostess. The German drank the finger bowl. Each offence was met with laughter and occasionally imitation, but the real sufferers were the hosts, torn between pride and panic. Hosting foreigners meant walking a diplomatic tightrope. To correct a guest was rude. To allow chaos was worse. They endured endless internal monologues. Should I explain the oyster fork? No, they'll think me pompous. But if I don't, they'll use the salad fork for pudding and I'll have to move to Devon. One poor hostess reportedly burst into tears after a Russian prince buttered his bread with his dessert spoon. He was so charming, she wept, but I can never unsee it. And yet, for all the horror stories, these mixed dinners were often the most memorable. They broke the monotony of British politeness, injecting life, sometimes literally, in the form of gesticulating Italians, into what was otherwise a study in restraint. When a Frenchman laughed too loudly or an American clapped the butler on the back, something rare happened. The English actually felt alive. The rigid mask of Edwardian civility cracked, and for a few fleeting moments, people remembered that dinner could be, whisper it, enjoyable. In the grand tapestry of Edwardian dining, these cross-cultural mishaps were both comedy and revelation. The British prided themselves on control, but their foreign guests reminded them that joy, spontaneity, and even a bit of chaos had their charms. The French showed them that food could be flirtation. The Americans showed them that conversation could be fun, and the British, they showed everyone that panic, when done elegantly, was an art form. By the time dessert arrived, laughter usually won out. The misunderstandings became stories, the mistakes became memories, and even the most rigid host had to admit, chaos, handled gracefully, was the most fashionable course of all. By the turn of the 20th century, something scandalous was happening to Edwardian dining. People began eating in public. The age of private dinner parties and secret etiquette rehearsals was giving way to a bold new world, the restaurant. For centuries, the upper and middle classes had considered eating outside the home vaguely indecent, like singing loudly on a train. Food was something done behind closed doors, under chandeliers and away from witnesses. But as cities modernized and fortunes shifted, dining out became the latest thrill of civilization, a performance of elegance staged before an audience of total strangers. A restaurant was like a theatre, only the critics were armed with forks. At first, this shift horrified traditionalists. The idea that one might pay to eat in public, surrounded by unknown people doing the same thing, seemed positively anarchic. But the restaurant revolution was irresistible. London, Paris, and New York all glittered with new establishments promising fine food, finer decor, and most importantly, the chance to be seen. Dining ceased to be a private ritual of refinement. It became a social spectacle. To be spotted at the Savoy or the Ritz wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. You weren't just eating dinner, you were declaring relevance. The Edwardian restaurant was a marvel of design and ego. There were marble columns, velvet banquettes, orchestras tucked discreetly into corners, and chandeliers that dripped like frozen sunlight. Every detail screamed luxury, but also surveillance. The moment you walked through those gilt doors, you entered the court of public opinion. Other diners watched you the way modern audiences watch reality television, judging, admiring, secretly hoping for a small disaster. Every movement, how you unfolded your napkin, how you spoke to the waiter, even how you buttered your bread, was up for review. For those used to private dinners, this was a terrifying adjustment. At home, etiquette mistakes could be quietly forgiven. In a restaurant, they were public record. One spilled glass of wine could ruin your evening and, in the worst cases, your reputation. The wealthy brought their manners like armour, convinced the rest of the room was there to measure their refinement. In a sense, they weren't wrong. Restaurants became arenas of social comparison, a place where the nouveau riche could flaunt, the old money could sneer, and the middle class could practice pretending to belong. For the newly affluent, dining out was a rite of passage. The restaurant offered what drawing rooms could not: visibility. You could arrive in a hired carriage, dressed to the nines, and pretend you lived this way every night. Waiters, elegant, bilingual, occasionally terrifying, treated you as if you were royalty, provided you didn't make the fatal mistake of mispronouncing bouillabaisse. The aspirational middle classes treated restaurants as finishing schools in cutlery and confidence. Entire families rehearsed menus at home before daring to enter the Ritz, lest they order something mortifyingly simple like ham and eggs. The upper classes, however, viewed public dining with suspicion. To them, restaurants were noisy, democratic, and full of people who didn't know when to stop talking. Worse, there were menus. In a private dinner, the host chose the meal, saving everyone from decision fatigue. In a restaurant, one had to make choices publicly and risk revealing ignorance. Some patrons solved this problem by announcing, "I shall have what the chef recommends," which sounded sophisticated but secretly meant, "I cannot read French, and I fear humiliation." Waiters were the new referees of social grace. Trained in discretion, they observed everything and judged quietly. A skilled waiter could spot a self-made millionaire by how he handled a wine list, too assertive, too eager, and a title aristocrat by how little he acknowledged anyone else's existence. The waiter's raised eyebrow became the modern equivalent of the butler's silent disdain. To earn a nod of approval from one of these silent monarchs of service was, for many diners, the true triumph of the evening. And yet, restaurants were liberating in ways that terrified traditionalists. They blurred the boundaries of class and gender. Respectable women, once confined to home dining or heavily chaperoned teas, began appearing in public dining rooms, shocking society and delighting gossip columnists. Couples could dine alone without parental supervision, sparking moral panic and romantic opportunity in equal measure. For the first time, women could publicly enjoy food and conversation without scandal, provided they did so gracefully and without visible chewing. Of course, with this newfound freedom came new anxieties. The etiquette of the restaurant was a tangled hybrid, part private dinner, part public performance. Should one remove gloves? Speak to the waiter directly or through one's husband? How loud was too loud? One etiquette guide from 1910 warned women that laughter above the tone of the orchestra was a sound of social peril. Another reminded men that sending back a dish, however justified, suggests vulgarity and lack of breeding. The restaurant, for all its glitter, was a trap disguised as leisure, but the allure was irresistible. Restaurants became the pulse of modernity, where news broke, deals were struck, and reputations were made. The great hotels of London, the Savoy, the Carlton, Claridge's, became temples of taste, each promising luxury that bordered on the divine. Dinners were timed with musical performances. Menus printed in French became collectible souvenirs. A night at a fine restaurant wasn't just eating, it was arriving. Meanwhile, the middle classes devoured the trend with enthusiasm. Cheaper establishments flourished. Tea rooms, grills, and luncheon clubs that mimicked high-end service for a fraction of the cost. Here, one could experiment with etiquette in a forgiving environment, practicing phrases like delightful bouquet or just a dash of cream thank you, before graduating to more intimidating venues. These restaurants were rehearsal halls for social mobility. A successful meal without embarrassment was a personal victory, an approving glance from the waiter, a small miracle. Not everyone applauded the change. Moralists fretted that dining out encouraged vanity, indulgence, and, worst of all, conversation between strangers. But the tide had turned. Public dining was modern, exciting, and deliciously democratic. The Edwardian restaurant symbolized the shifting world, one where appearances still mattered, but where anyone with a clean collar and enough composure could join the show. By the time the orchestra struck its final chord and waiters dimmed the lamps, diners rose from their tables with practiced grace, satisfied not only by food but by performance. They had eaten under scrutiny, survived judgment, and lived to dine another day. Because in Edwardian Britain, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was where manners met modernity. And if you played your part well enough, you didn't just leave full, you left seen. In the vast hierarchy of Edwardian snobbery, few words caused more quiet panic than serviette. To the untrained ear, it sounded harmless, even elegant, borrowed from French, the language of refinement. But in the ears of the upper classes, it was linguistic dynamite. Say serviette at a dinner party, and you might as well confess to shopping your silverware at Woolworths. It wasn't just a vocabulary slip, it was a confession of class. In Edwardian Britain, the battle between napkin and serviette became a miniature cultural war. On one side stood the upper classes, staunch defenders of the Old English napkin, a word they claimed was as proper and pure as afternoon tea. On the other side stood the middle classes, newly prosperous, upwardly mobile, and tragically fond of the French-sounding serviette. To them it felt fancy, continental, and just a little glamorous. Unfortunately, it also marked them as outsiders faster than you could unfold one. To understand why this mattered, you must remember that Edwardian society was obsessed with signals. Everything from how you held your fork to how you addressed the servants announced your place in the pecking order. Speech was no exception. A single word could betray generations of ancestry or ambition. Pronounce garage the wrong way and you were socially doomed. Say toilet instead of lavatory, and you might as well have shouted across the table. But serviette, that was the linguistic scarlet letter of the era. The irony, of course, was that both words had respectable histories. Serviette came from French, used for centuries in aristocratic courts. But by the Edwardian era, the upper classes had decided that anything too French-sounding smacked of middle-class mimicry. Napkin was deemed the only acceptable term, solid, Anglo-Saxon, and reassuringly dull. Serviette, meanwhile, had slipped down the social ladder, finding a new home among shopkeepers, clerks, and other respectable people who didn't know they were being ridiculed for it. The linguistic divide was so severe that etiquette manuals of the time began issuing warnings. Mrs. Humphrey, writing under the pen name Madge, cautioned readers in Manners for Women, 1909, never say serviette. The correct term is napkin. The former betrays pretension and ignorance. The warning was delivered in the same tone one might use for rabies. The goal of every aspiring hostess became clear. Purge your vocabulary of serviettes before they betrayed you. Dinner tables became linguistic minefields. Imagine the horror of a nervous middle-class guest, determined to impress, unfolding a napkin and chirping, "What a lovely serviette!" The silence that followed could have frozen the soup. The hostess's smile tightened, the butler's eyebrow twitched, and somewhere the family's ancestors shuddered in their portraits. The guest might recover socially eventually, but the damage was done. No number of polite smiles or properly angled forks could erase the sound of that fatal word. The British class system, ever eager for new distinctions, adored this sort of micro-snobbery. It allowed people to judge one another without seeming rude. You didn't need to ask someone's income or family background, you just listened to their nouns. Linguistic etiquette became a form of gatekeeping, subtle, deniable, and utterly ruthless. The serviette scandal proved that in Edwardian Britain, even fabric terminology could destroy ambition. Middle-class magazines, desperate to help their readers avoid embarrassment, tried to educate the public. Articles appeared with titles like "Words That Betray" and "The Language of Good Society." They explained that drawing room was proper, lounge was vulgar, sofa was refined, settee was common, and under no circumstances should one utter serviette. To make matters worse, the upper classes were inconsistent. They themselves had borrowed dozens of French words for food, menu, entree, consommé, yet mocked others for adopting serviette. Hypocrisy, of course, was the national dish. The butlers and maids, the silent witnesses to these linguistic duels, found the whole affair hilarious. Below stairs, they often used serviette deliberately when talking amongst themselves, a small rebellion against their employer's pretensions. Lady Pembroke says napkin, "I say serviette," one maid reportedly joked, "and we both wipe the same soup off the same silk." It was the kind of humour that made the servant halls crackle with laughter. Yet for many middle-class climbers, the stakes were deadly serious. The word serviette could expose a lifetime of effort. A man might build a fortune, buy an estate and dress like a duke, but the wrong word could unravel his disguise faster than cheap thread. Linguistic precision became the final frontier of social mobility. Some families even practiced speech correction dinners, where children were trained to avoid forbidden words before they faced the real world. Parents whispered corrections over pudding like military commands. "Not serviette, darling. We're better than that now." Restaurants and hotels made the war even more complicated. French-speaking waiters, unaware of British linguistic neurosis, used serviette freely. It was, after all, the actual French word. This threw British diners into existential crisis. The truly refined guest pretended not to hear it. The middle-class guest, eager to fit in, used it back and sealed their own doom. Thus, a single French syllable continued to wreak havoc across the empire. The controversy grew so absurd that it even reached literature. Writers like Nancy Mitford later immortalised the you and non-you distinction, upper-class versus non-upper-class vocabulary. But the Edwardians had already perfected the game. Saying napkin meant you belonged to tradition. Saying serviette meant you were trying too hard. The line between refinement and ridicule was thin, folded neatly and placed on your lap. By the eve of the First World War, the battle had cooled slightly, but its ghost lingered. The word serviette never fully recovered in upper-class circles. Even today, echoes of that snobbery remain, a linguistic fossil from the age when the British Empire could govern half the globe, yet lose its composure over a piece of linen. So next time you unfold a napkin or a serviette, depending on your social confidence, remember, in Edwardian Britain, that simple act carried the weight of an entire class system. The fork might test your manners, the soup might test your patience, but the napkin tested your pedigree. Because sometimes the difference between refined and ridiculous wasn't in how you dined, it was in what you called the thing that kept you clean while doing it. For all its polished perfection, Edwardian etiquette was a game no one could play flawlessly, not even the people who invented it. Behind every rule, every gleaming fork, and every word of Debrett's lurked stories of glorious failure. Because even in an age obsessed with composure, humanity found a way to spill gravy on it. And as it turns out, even the royals weren't safe, though their mistakes were politely rebranded as traditions. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII himself, was both the patron saint and habitual offender of dinner-table blunders. His appetite for food, and inconveniently for gossip, was legendary. At one state banquet in the 1890s, he was reportedly caught buttering his asparagus, a direct violation of high-table law. Asparagus, according to etiquette, was to be eaten delicately with the fingers, not savaged with cutlery like an amateur. The court held its collective breath. The butler froze. The prince, unbothered, took a bite, smiled and declared, "It's rather good this way." And just like that, the faux pas became royal fashion. Within a week, polite society was stabbing asparagus with wild abandon, murmuring, "The prince does it, you know." That was Edwardian etiquette in a nutshell. One man's mistake became another's precedent, provided the man wore a crown. The upper classes loved to pretend they followed sacred, immutable rules, but those rules bent instantly if royalty broke them. When the king accidentally wiped his mouth with the wrong side of his napkin, newspapers began calling it a sign of relaxed modernity. If an earl did the same thing, it was vulgar haste. Class, as always, determined whether your error was scandal or style. The history of etiquette disasters is a long and glittering one, but none were more entertaining than those that happened under the scrutiny of hundreds. Take the 1907 Windsor dinner, where a nervous young duchess, seated next to a foreign ambassador, tried to impress him with her command of French. Unfortunately, her French came from a governess with more enthusiasm than accuracy. When served an unfamiliar dish, she exclaimed cheerfully, "Je suis très excitée," unaware that the phrase carried rather suggestive undertones. The ambassador nearly dropped his spoon. The room went quiet enough to hear the soup cool. The king, after a heroic pause, saved the moment by announcing, "Indeed, we all are. The laughter that followed became the polite curtain over a mortifying scene. Then there was the case of Lord Beresford, a naval officer known for both courage and clumsiness. At a dinner in 1902, while attempting to make polite conversation, he gestured enthusiastically with his fork, which promptly launched a piece of sole across the table and onto a dowager's décolletage. The lady, demonstrating true aristocratic reflexes, simply dabbed at the fish with her napkin and continued her story as if nothing had happened. That, as the saying went, was how one handled a crisis with breeding. Lord Beresford was less composed. He reportedly tried to retrieve the fish and nearly toppled a candelabra in the process. From that evening onward, he was affectionately nicknamed the Admiral of the Soul. Even the most gilded households weren't immune to chaos. Queen Victoria's old rule that no one speaks until the sovereign does persisted well into the Edwardian era, leading to countless awkward silences when monarchs forgot their lines. At one dinner, King Edward VII became distracted by the dessert menu and failed to start conversation for nearly 5 minutes. The guests sat frozen, spoons hovering mid-air, terrified to utter a sound. Finally, the king looked up, realised the paralysis he'd caused, and muttered, "Oh, do get on with it." Etiquette experts later debated whether that constituted permission to speak or an insult to pudding. Some blunders were less verbal, more physical. The Prince of Wales's famous girth presented frequent logistical challenges at formal dinners. One evening at Sandringham, while attempting to navigate between tightly spaced chairs, he caught the edge of a tablecloth with his cuff. What followed was the slowest, grandest disaster imaginable. An entire table setting slid gracefully toward him, followed by a cascade of cutlery and crystal. Guests leapt to assist, but the king, laughing, waved them off. "Let it fall," he said cheerfully. Dinner needed some excitement. It was a perfect royal recovery, turning chaos into charm, and proof that confidence could polish even catastrophe. Others were not so lucky. Poor Lady Hertford, a noted social climber, secured an invitation to a royal garden party in 1910, her lifelong dream. During luncheon, she reached for the sugar tongs, lost her grip, and launched 2 sugar cubes squarely into Queen Alexandra's teacup. Witnesses claimed the Queen's smile never faltered. "How very generous," she said serenely. "You've sweetened it for me." Lady Hertford, however, was never seen at court again. The press by this time had begun to delight in such tales. Society pages became chronicles of public embarrassment, politely disguised as anecdotes. One popular headline from 1912 read, "Peer spills port, preserves poise." Newspapers knew that nothing thrilled readers more than seeing the mighty tremble, even if it was only over soup. Etiquette disasters were, after all, the great only equaliser. Beneath all the pomp, everyone was one misplaced fork away from ruin. But perhaps the most telling blunders were the quiet ones, moments when people tried too hard to appear perfect. A young actress, newly famous and desperate to prove her refinement, was invited to dine with a viscount. Terrified of using the wrong utensil, she copied every move her neighbour made. Unfortunately, her neighbour was left-handed. Halfway through the meal, the entire left side of the table was mimicking her, a mirror image ballet of misunderstanding. The butler described it later as the most elegant confusion I have ever seen. Even servants trained to preserve dignity at all costs sometimes faltered. One butler in 1908 fainted mid-service after catching sight of a guest attempting to eat jelly with a knife. His collapse was so dignified that several guests thought it part of the evening's entertainment. The incident was later described by the hostess as a splendid example of loyalty to etiquette unto death. In truth, these disasters did more than amuse. They exposed the absurdity of a system that demanded inhuman grace under inhuman pressure. The Edwardians' greatest terror was not famine or war, but embarrassment. Their social structure was so fragile that a sneeze could shake it. Yet the stories endure because they reveal the strange, charming resilience of the people who lived within it. They may have dropped the cutlery, spilled the wine, and mispronounced the menu, but they always somehow smiled through it. And so, for every royal spill and aristocratic blunder, a lesson was learned. Perfection was never the true mark of class. Recovery was. The ability to laugh, to deflect, to pretend it was intentional, that was the art form. Because in Edwardian Britain, grace under pressure wasn't about never failing. It was about failing with enough elegance to make everyone else doubt it happened at all. In Edwardian Britain, the fork was more than metal. It was identity, morality, and Zibon's silent warfare all pressed into a four-pronged reminder that civilization was fragile and table manners were its last line of defense. The fork wasn't just a utensil, it was a social weapon with four sharp points of judgment. Every gleam of silver on the table carried meaning, and in the Edwardian imagination the fork might as well have been engraved with the words, "Know your place, hold it properly, and never ever stab downward." To understand the fork's cultural weight, you have to see it through Edwardian eyes. This was an age obsessed with distinction, of class, of breeding, of composure. Industrialization had blurred old hierarchies. The middle class was climbing, money was multiplying, and people who'd once eaten with their hands were now ordering oysters in French. So how did the old elite prove they were still superior? They did it with forks. The way one held it, used it, and even looked at it became a coded performance of refinement. The upper classes gripped their forks delicately, like butterflies that might fly away if offended. The middle classes, newly minted and terrified of looking gauche, gripped theirs too tightly, as though strangling anxiety itself. The poor, of course, gripped whatever they could, if they even had a fork at all. Thus the nation divided itself not by bloodline or coin, but by cutlery posture. A crooked wrist could undo a lifetime of social aspiration. The fork's rise to power had been slow and scandalous. Only a few centuries earlier it was considered suspiciously foreign, an Italian affectation, effeminate and unnecessary. But by the Edwardian era, the fork had ascended the throne of the dinner table, ruling over spoons and knives with polished tyranny. The Victorians had sanctified it. The Edwardians weaponized it. To them, the fork represented control over food, over the body, over chaos itself. You didn't just eat with it, you demonstrated restraint. There were rules, of course, endless rules. Fork in the left hand, knife in the right, never switch them mid-meal, unless you were a dangerous American. Tines down for cutting, tines up for delicacies, and God help you if you gestured with it. The British fork technique was a ballet of precision, designed to make even eating look noble. The goal was to appear so at ease with the ritual that no one noticed the fear behind it. Because make no mistake, fear was at the heart of every fork movement. The fear of dropping it, the fear of clinking it, the fear of being watched. And everyone was watching. In Edwardian society, dining was surveillance dressed as civility. Every guest judged every other guest silently, pretending to admire the chandeliers while mentally noting whose fork hand trembled. Servants noticed, too. A butler could tell your upbringing from 10 feet away by the angle at which you speared a potato. As one footman famously remarked, the upper crust holds its fork like art, the middle crust like duty, the lower crust like hunger. But the fork was more than etiquette. It was ideology. It represented the Edwardian belief that self-restraint was the essence of civilization. To eat neatly was to prove mastery over instinct. A person who handled their fork with poise could be trusted with property, power, even empire. A person who didn't? Barbarism in evening dress. That's why so many etiquette manuals of the time treated dining as moral education. The fork, one guide solemnly declared, is the measure of a man's discipline. You could cheat at cards, lie to your accountant and still be forgiven, but hold your fork like a shovel and society would never forget. And yet, the fork was also a stage prop in the grand farce of Edwardian insecurity. Beneath the stiff collars and social codes, everyone knew the rules were ridiculous. How could a piece of cutlery possibly define worth? But that was precisely the point. The more absurd the standard, the more exclusive it became. If elegance required effort, confusion, and at least one quiet panic attack per meal. Only the right people could achieve it. The symbolism extended even to the materials. Silver forks gleamed with heritage. Steel ones whispered factory. Polished handles signified servants to polish them. Tarnish suggested decline. The truly elite had entire sets engraved with family crests, each fork a genealogical flex. The nouveau riche tried to imitate, of course, commissioning monograms so ornate they looked like ransom notes. But true refinement wasn't in the design. It was in the ease. To use a fork without thinking was to be born to it. To think about it was to prove you weren't. Artists and writers of the time noticed the absurdity. Satirical cartoons in Punch depicted anxious diners tangled in cutlery, drowning under an avalanche of rules. In one, a trembling clerk whispers, "Which fork for despair?" while a smug gentleman replies, "The one furthest to the right." The humour worked because it was true. The fork was both symbol and symptom of a society so terrified of embarrassment that it mistook anxiety for grace. The fork also had a gendered meaning. For men, it symbolised discipline, the ability to control one's appetite, one's conversation, and one's temper. For women, it was a performance of delicacy, how to take impossibly small bites while appearing delighted by starvation. To eat heartily was unladylike. To eat too little was ungrateful. The fork became an instrument of constraint, both social and physical. A woman's ability to wield it elegantly while corseted and faint from hunger was considered proof of breeding. And yet, despite all its pretensions, the fork remained a deeply democratic object, or at least it threatened to be. As the middle classes grew wealthier and more self-assured, the fork's exclusivity began to crumble. Mass production made cutlery accessible to nearly everyone. You no longer needed a butler or a bloodline to own one. For the first time, even factory workers could dine with a fork and knife instead of a spoon or fingers. The very symbol of elitism became quite literally industrialised. The old guard hated it. The working classes, meanwhile, picked it up with quiet satisfaction and a freedom from the crippling self-consciousness that plagued their betters. By the end of the Edwardian era, as the First World War loomed, the fork had lost some of its sting. The world was changing, fast, violently, irreversibly. Manners began to matter less than survival. But for one shining, ridiculous moment in history, the fork had ruled Britain like a miniature sceptre, embodying its greatest strengths and its most absurd insecurities. So the next time you pick one up, remember, in Edwardian England, this simple object wasn't just for dinner. It was a mirror, polished, pointed, and utterly judgmental, reflecting a world that believed civility could be measured in millimetres of silver. Because in the end, the fork didn't just feed the Edwardians, it defined them. By the time the Edwardian era drew its last breath in the smoke and thunder of the First World War, its dinner tables stood like miniature monuments to a vanished world, glittering, anxious, and meticulously polished. The chandeliers dimmed, the butlers enlisted, and the fine china was packed away or rationed out. Yet even as the empire crumbled and manners relaxed, something of the Edwardian dinner table survived. Its rules, its rituals, and most of all its insecurities trickled quietly into the modern age. We may eat sushi with chopsticks now, but the fear of looking stupid never left the table. The Edwardians had believed passionately that civilization was something you performed. It wasn't what you were, it was how you appeared while buttering bread. To them, every meal was a declaration of order against the chaos of the world. When the Great War arrived and tore that order apart, the old rules seemed suddenly irrelevant. And yet, curiously, they never fully disappeared. They simply shapeshifted. The fork lost its crown, but etiquette found new empires. Restaurants, business lunches, weddings, first dates. The dinner table remained a stage, only the script changed. By the 1920s, the grand rituals of Edwardian dining had begun to loosen their corsets. Servants were scarce, fortunes had thinned, and the social ladder had splintered. Formal dining gave way to something leaner, freer, but still haunted by its past. Middle-class homes adopted smaller tables and simpler meals, Yet the ghost of Edwardian propriety lingered in every instruction. Don't slouch. Don't talk with your mouth full. Don't use your Moi knife like a shovelee. These weren't just habits. They were hand-me-down anxieties, reminders that one's dignity still depended on how tidily one consumed stew. The new age of dining democratized what the Edwardians had hoarded. Hotels and restaurants, once symbols of exclusivity, opened their doors to wider audiences. Public dining, once a nerve-wracking performance, became routine. Yet even as formality faded, people carried forward that same low-level dread of judgment. It no longer mattered whether your fork was silver or steel. What mattered was whether you used it properly. The modern diner still rehearses their manners like lines in a play, terrified of committing the social equivalent of dropping a fork in front of the king. The Edwardian ideal of poise under pressure also survived. It simply swapped candlelit dining rooms for boardrooms and dinner dates. The ability to appear calm while sweating internally became the modern mark of sophistication. Business etiquette, in particular, grew directly from Edwardian roots. Firm handshake, but not too firm, careful posture, steady tone, and always the delicate choreography of eating in public without humiliation. The Edwardians had feared being judged by dukes. We fear being judged by colleagues with LinkedIn profiles. Progress, as usual, came with a new flavour of panic. And then there's fashion, because food and fashion were always cousins in the Edwardian psyche. Back then, dinner required tuxedos, tiaras, and enough starch to make your shirt double as armour. Today, we may not dress for dinner with quite the same fervour, but the anxiety remains. What to wear, how to sit, which glass to grab first. The dinner table is still a place where humans perform their best selves, or at least try to look like they know what they're doing while holding a fork upside down. Even the language of dining carries Edwardian DNA. The word napkin outlived serviette as the linguistic heir to good taste, while table manners became shorthand for social respectability. The obsession with refinement, once a survival strategy for the gentry, became a universal expectation. The Edwardians taught the world that how you eat reflects who you are. We still believe that, only now we broadcast it on Instagram. The 1908 hostess compared silver. The 225 diner compares plating. Either way, someone's being judged for the wrong garnish. What's remarkable is how deeply Edwardian formality etched itself into modern muscle memory. The way we hold cutlery, pour wine, or pass the salt all stem from rituals meant to display restraint, not convenience. Even casual dining still borrows their choreography. The waiter replaces the butler, the hostess stand replaces the drawing room, and would you like still or sparkling is just the 21st century version of do you prefer the fish or the pheasant? The anxiety of choice never went away, it just got carbonated. And that anxiety, that deep inherited tension between wanting to belong and fearing exposure, might be the truest Edwardian legacy of all. The empire may have fallen, but the social battlefield of the dinner table remains. We still dread spilling something, mispronouncing something, or ordering something unpronounceable. A century later, the same questions echo beneath our modern manners. Am I doing this right? Do I look like I belong here? Does anyone notice the fork I just dropped? Yet there's something oddly endearing about the persistence of these ghosts. The Edwardians may have been absurd, but their obsession with civility came from a place of yearning, the belief that a shared code of behaviour, however ridiculous, could make life more graceful. They believed that if everyone just learned to use the right fork, the world would somehow stay in order. And though the world has grown louder, faster, and infinitely messier since, we still reach for that illusion, the hope that grace can be practiced into existence. Perhaps that's why the Edwardian table still fascinates us. Beneath its silver and starch was a fragile humanity that feels achingly familiar. They were terrified of embarrassment. We're terrified of awkwardness. They faked composure. We curate confidence. They worried about which fork to use. We see how to pronounce gnocchi. The tools have changed, but the panic hasn't. So yes, we may now eat sushi with chopsticks, tacos with our hands, and salads from plastic bowls. But deep down, the Edwardian ghost still hovers, whispering, "Sit up straight, wipe your mouth and don't make a scene." We laugh at their fussiness while secretly sharing their fear. Because the truth is, every meal, whether served on fine china or take-out trays, is still a little performance of belonging. The Edwardians taught us the choreography, and we've been improvising ever since. Their table may have vanished, but their legacy endures, not in silver or starch, but in that universal, timeless human instinct, to sit down to eat and to hope no one notices the soup on our sleeve. Because long after the empire crumbled, one truth remains unbreakable: dinner, like dignity, is always served with a side of nerves.